Hello and welcome to another episode of the War Report. A lot has happened over the past 8 or so days since we last did our previous episodes. Looks like those were pretty well received. I know there were some audio issues. You wouldn't believe the internal war I had to wage against my internet to even get that show to function. So I thank you all for bearing with us for that. But getting into this past week or so's news, there's quite a bit that happened, and we should begin with the Forgotten War, as it were, with some brief updates around Ukraine. Not too much has happened, but there are some developments, some things that may show further activity in the coming months and really shows the direction the war is going in, mainly near towards Avdiivka and towards the Kherson front. Like I said, no major movements, but there are things in the works, and it does look like some pretty substantial developing situation. So I'll hand it over to you to give us more detail about that.
Yeah. So, not much exchange of territory. There have been small gains, mostly for the Russians, but it has been, I would say, frank, it has been costly for them in Avdiivka. I'll elaborate on this later. But what I'll do first is show you basically the second counteroffensive that Ukraine is in the midst of launching. This is sort of, if Avdiivka has been the story in the Ukraine war for the last 10, 11 days, because the Russians launched an offensive. No, okay, I can say they launched an offensive, but really they've been fighting there since 2014, not the Russian army, but against the Donbass people and the Novorossiya, um, various platoons and stuff like, or, those people, right? Like, the forces of the Russian Spring, as Dugan would put it, right? So, not the Russian army. So, but before I get any more into Avdiivka, let me just to like um, put some emphasis on the battles and the potential battles that are taking place in Kherson and Crimea. So this is the second counteroffensive that Ukraine wants to launch before the end of the year, because the Rasputitsa is going to begin, the heavy rains are going to begin. They've already started falling in some areas, and it will only increase as we move into November.
Oh, absolutely. And just
Uh,
just as an aside, something I like to do every day is I love to stalk weather radar when there's nothing to do at work because I work in a very slow-paced job. So I've been doing that for the past week. I've been looking particularly at the weather rolling into Ukraine. It actually does look like over the next 48 to 72 hours over the course of the weekend, a pretty substantial amount of rain is actually going to move into the country over the weekend.
yes. So I just sent you two slides. This is from the Dmitry, from the Dima channel. Well, Dima is short for Dmitry, right?
Yeah, I'll go
I
ahead
don't know
and
if
get the
our
telegram up.
audience knows that. Um, so these maps kind of reflect what has been going on for the last 2.5 days. Okay. Uh, this bit that you see from Crimea, uh, there have not been any landings. The most significant thing, though, that has happened in the last 24 hours is that the Ukrainians have sent a ship. The ship, to me, does not look like, from the video footage, like a proper Navy ship, but it looks like a big granary tanker. The Russians fired 3 to 4 missiles at it. These aren't like big missiles, but some kind of missiles. They hit it, they damaged it, but it didn't sink. So the speculation is that this is like a typical reconnaissance in force, right? You're not going there to take over. You're probably going to get damaged, and you're probably going to have losses. But it's rare that you're going to achieve something other than gathering information. So um, if that attack would happen, it would happen in the way it looks in the first slide. So that's the spit that we're talking about. Now, it would be if the Ukrainians actually took over this area, it would be very hard for them to maintain it because, I mean, just look at it, right? The Russians would have an easy way to bombard this area. They have the Ukrainians sent out teams sometimes on sea-doos, um, and on small boats, where they land and then they unfurl the Ukrainian flag, then they get back in the boats. Um, it would be a bigger PR victory for them if they did anything. But the weather is going to change. It's going to get worse, and there have been attempts here that have been for the Ukrainians fatal. But in their position, they need to do this in order to gain funding because, as we know now, even some small businesses in Ukraine can only survive with American funding. So if American funding stops, they will collapse. And if you want, later we can talk about Biden and what he has proposed,
Yeah.
the money he has proposed for Ukraine and for Israel that he mentioned tonight. So,
60 billion
the,
and 14 respectively.
yes, yes. 10 billion for Israel has already been secured, though.
Oh, of course
So
it
this would be
has.
another. What did you say? 14 billion?
14 billion is what they
Yeah,
brought in front of it. And I'll hold my tongue on the Israel stuff because I have a lot to say later, but I won't
yeah,
derail this.
yeah. Oh, yeah. This show is going to be a lot about Israel. So anyway, so that's the first slide. You've got that up, right?
Yeah, I
And
got both
then
of them up.
okay, and so the second slide, you notice in the first slide, to the far right, this is where the other area of attack that the Ukrainians have made. They entered as far deep as a village called Poima, which I know in Macedonian and Serbian and Croatian, Poima, like Nemam Poima, means I have no idea. Like it's a way of saying I don't know. So, anyways, but I'm sure this, and I know we had a listener that said Pokrov. Pokrov does not mean like toward blood or new blood. It means shroud. Now, it does mean shroud in Macedonian as well. Pokrov.
Yeah, and I've actually
The Russians and Ukrainians say a different word for shroud. But my guess, okay, I'm not being stubborn. I really am not. But I keep thinking, during the liturgy, when we have the blood of Christ and we have that shroud that is waved over it during the reading of the liturgy. I just wonder if that's actually like etymologically, if that's the explainer or not. Anyhow, I don't want to. I don't want to dwell. This is a war show. So, anyways,
we should do a
um,
linguistic show. Yeah, that
we should.
jot it down, jot it down.
So, um, this attack also has been, I mean, I should differentiate. That's spit of Crimea. There has not been a huge attack. There have been no landing parties at all, not even small ones. Um, Other than the boats that had tried during the course of the summer and some about 3-4 weeks ago. So, but in this area around the village of Poima, the Ukrainians did manage to get a foothold for several hours. And they were pushed back. Now, in the process, there is a video of a railroad crossing that they had stationed themselves around, and the Russians knocked it out. And anyways, there's even Dima's channel won't show all the bodies. He does have like another channel that actually shows these videos, but so that's really the hot current battle taking place right now. The potential counteroffensive, the second counteroffensive of 2023 for the Ukrainians. Now I'm going to show you a bit more in depth, and there are various maps. None of them seem to agree on what is going on in Avdiivka. When this battle started, I believe October the 10th, and we're recording today on the 9th, so it's been 9 days. Um, there were all kinds of rumors that they had crossed the railroad line in the north. that they had entered, I believe, a village called Berdachi, but there was never video confirmation of this. And Slaviangrad, had these maps and stuff. None of this ever bore out. And this is the problem with like some channels. Even Deep State, which normally is very good, has been found to do the same thing, right? And I wonder if this is because, like, I don't know, a small squad entered like some village 10 kilometers and then they retreat, and then that's considered. I don't know, but the Russians never crossed the railroad line. They did take out the station there, where there was some ammo being stored by the Ukrainians, but that was back on like I believe October the 10th or October the 9th. I think the 9th when they were preparing for the assault. Um, so this map I believe is that I'm going to send you, I believe is from 2-3 days ago. You can take a look at maybe what has been gained so far. And then I'll show you some maps by Weeb Union, and he always relies on Syriac maps, which has been overall, they all have faults, but overall the most accurate and the most consistent. Now, this is in the southern part of Avdiivka, okay, that you're looking at. And you can see the bits of new territories that the Russians have gained. This is actually the most insane part to try to attack in Avdiivka, okay? And I'm going to show you why that is, because first of all, let's get a map of like what Avdiivka looks like in terms of its topography, okay? So you can see, ignore the Rabotino, okay? That's just like the at for the name of this channel. But you can see that Avdiivka is on a ridge. Most of it is on a ridge. So it's very difficult to attack the city. It also has a lot of high rises. Over, see the arrow that is pointing to Terikon. Terikon
Yes.
is a big mound. Now the Russians apparently captured this for a day or less than a day, and then they were pushed back. Um, some have said that again, it's a question of logistics. Like their supply, there's something wrong with their supply lines. They don't send enough men. I don't know, but it was so now they no longer control that round thing, but are around that round thing. It's that area is in the gray zone. So the controls it. And let me now send you the push, the description of what had happened. Let's say when the attack first happened. I'm sorry, I just had it here and I don't see it. Oh yes, here it is. So this is sort of like the attack from the north, how it was going. Okay, there's the village of Berdechi and Petrovskoye. Nobody knew whether they actually reached Petrovskoye. Um, so the Russians, that line that you see going north-south, beginning from the top left-hand corner, going southward, that is the railroad line that goes into Avdiivka. The Russians are not past that line. There's disputes about how close they are to it, but they do control that area or that side overall. And now I'm going to show you the maps that describe really the situation in the south. Now, ironically, it's in the south that the Russians have had the most gains. Here's a topographical view of where Avdiivka is. That salient, right? So the way to understand Avdiivka is as a city, as a town, it's smaller than Bakhmut, but it's, I believe, bigger than Solidar. However, it has an underground system because of the capacity of its industrial sector was so high during the Soviet era that it actually has a maze that is bigger than that of Mariupol at the Azovstal. Okay, so I would presume that the Ukrainians have a ton of munitions here. Normal bombs are not going to work. This is, and you know, it even brings me back, sadly, I have to say this, um, is that, you know, Strelkov, you know, was pushing for Slavyansk. Now he left Slavyansk. There were criticism like Texas bent, Russell bent Texas or something or another. That guy, you know, he said he's the only one who ever retreated. I don't know. Maybe there's like a you know, a personal problem or like a clash of personalities. In any case, if Avdiivka was clearly, in my opinion, was clearly the area that they should have focused on and should not have wasted trying to go to Konstantinovka, Kramatorsk, Slavyansk. Like, they overextended themselves. If they had taken Avdiivka, they would not be in this situation. Anyways, hindsight, right? But I think that was something that a lot of people could have guessed. The people who have been living there, who, you know, in 2014, that would have been in their 60s and 70s, could have easily verified just, you know, because there's a coke plant there, there's a chemical plant, there's a mine, right? This is a very, like, all of Donbass is highly industrial, right? Big underground tunnels. Like, it's not, it's like you saw those in Solidar. Avdiivka has apparently bigger ones than those. Uh, so on the scale and bigger than that, in the Azovstal plant in Mariupol. So um, that gives you an overview of what it looked like. Now I'm going to show you the kind of trench system that they had to, and there was a storming operation in the south again, where the Russians were successful. Um, so I'll give you this. This is from a few days ago. Okay, you can see that parts of Avdiivka in the right area, the Russians already control. But look at where this new territory has been taken. Okay, focus on that, and now focus on what it took to get this area. Okay, and this. All these blue lines that you see here are trench networks from a year ago. There are more trench networks than this. So you can see how difficult this is. Okay, now I'm going to show you the further gains that they just made today. Okay. Now, if you go back to the earlier picture I showed you, not the most recent one, the one with the trench lines, you're going to see like uh, a little yellow blip with a knife and fork. This was a kind of a resort hotel. It's called the Tsarskaya Ochota, like, you know, the emperor's hotel or hunt club or like lodgings, right? Now, this area I would presume is very, very heavily fortified. To get to this area, of course, there's the elaborate trench work, but there's also a forest. So it's ironic that most of the gains for the Russians have been in the south. I would presume that the reason for this is, while I talk, I'll send you another one. These are a few days old, but like I said, there's not much changed except for the little bit that they captured today. And there was a video confirmation of this. So my reasoning is this: the southern part is a very well fortified part with lots of forest and trenches, and they believe, like, if you take it, Ukraine can still get supplies into Avdiivka from the north. So there's no reason to worry about it just yet. And it's why they have fought so fiercely, the Ukrainians have, in the north to prevent the Russians from taking it. Simplicus had a article that he wrote on his Substack where he confirms that they have been roughly since from October the 10th to, I believe, October the 7th or 6th, the Russians have lost 15 tanks and possibly 30 armored personnel carriers. Now, today and yesterday, I can see that they lost at least another 2 tanks, probably 3, and at least 2 or 3 personnel carriers. So, 18, 19 tanks, 45, 46 personnel carriers for 9 days of fighting. That's pretty severe. I haven't seen that many bodies, but I have seen definite. I mean, of course, there's dead, no question, but there are significant material loss. But nonetheless, I would say this: in most of the attacks that the Russians have carried out, they go like really hard for like 3 days, and then they stop. And then 3, 4 weeks, they might try something again. They don't just keep going and going and going. The Russians did take a break after the first few days. That is true. And the original assault did have a lot of tanks. But my guess is that they want to capture Avdiivka. And I think Zelensky understands this. Today, he put out a call to Zelensky and the Ukrainian military that under no circumstances can Avdiivka fall. Because this is the most fortified town, yes. It is the town that shells Donetsk City. And for 3 days, there were no bombings of Donetsk City when this battle was going on. So we know it's coming from Avdiivka, right? Now, if the Russians they don't have to take it, but if they do a proper encirclement with a small gap that they have fire control over, the way they did in Bakhmut, they can remember those roads leading into Bakhmut that they were littered with like destroyed armor all over the
Oh
place
yeah,
and
yeah.
supply trucks. That ideally is what they want, and they want that to happen when the rains start coming down. So that is, I think, why the Russians are fighting so hard there. And if it does fall, of course, it will not be just symbolic the way Bakhmut was. It will be very significant. It will be symbolic, yes, of course, but it will have an impact on the lives of the people in Donetsk City. There's no question, right? Now, one of the things that might have slowed things down is about 4 days ago, there was a bridge in Gorlovka. Now, Gorlovka is a town just northeast of Donetsk City. It's like directly east of Avdiivka. It's a much larger city. It's many times larger than Avdiivka. But a bridge was destroyed there, and it was not a missile. Missiles have a very hard time destroying bridges, just so people know, right? You can almost never destroy them, right? To destroy a bridge, you have to destroy it from its foundation, and that is what happened, which means that Russia still has issues with people working for Ukraine uh, committing these attacks, right? Now, nobody was killed, but this is a major route, and they use it. So that's something to keep in mind. There have been some gains for the Ukrainians south of Bakhmut, around Andreevka and Klishevka. They've managed to push the Russians out of the railway area. But my guess is they will throw more manpower into this area, of course, and they will want to get the best positions possible before an assault. I guess on taking Bakhmut, I don't know. I mean, there's nothing left in Bakhmut, and defending Bakhmut proper, because it's several kilometers south of Bakhmut, will be much easier for the Russians than it will be for the Ukrainians to enter. In any case, now that Avdiivka, now that it looks like the Russians, even though today was not a successful day for the Russians, as I said, they've lost at least 2 tanks, mostly to mines, and at least 3 armored personnel carriers, right? And they had to retreat. Now, thank goodness that they only lost 5 vehicles, because it could have been much worse. The Russians are smart about that. Like when that happens, they pull back. They're not going to waste lives and machinery until they figure something out. The Ukrainians have moved regiments from the Zaporozhye front around Robotine, Robotino, and including Leopards. One Leopard tank was spotted. So they are very serious about this of Avdiivka. And then, I would say that the Russians keeping pressure on Avdiivka is actually really good. And the reason is several reasons. One of them is that it makes life easier for the people in Donetsk and to some extent in Gorlovka. Another is it lays off the pressure in Bakhmut, because the Ukrainians have actually lost even more lives and material around taking the territory that they did in Bakhmut to capture the railroad line that leads to Bakhmut than they have in the Robotina area. As for the rest of the front, ammo depots have been destroyed. The Ukrainians, another HIMAR successful strike at an ammo depot outside of Kupiansk. The Kupiansk push by the Russians is over. I mean, they're going to try to activate it maybe again, but it's not like, I mean, it's just another territory. It's like they're taking, even if they took Kupiansk, it would not change the situation in the Donetsk People's Republic the way Avdiivka would. Like there would be, notice even taking Bakhmut did not give the kind of results that Donetsk wanted and needed. But Avdiivka would do that, right? And like I say, as long as they can starve them out, if they can do a proper siege, they'll be in a good position. But the trick will be is to cut off Ukraine from the north. The south, they don't have to try to take more territory there. It's important. It's on a ridge. It's the highest area of Avdiivka. Yes, it's true. But it could be very, very costly and very bloody. And like I say, the success that the Russians have there is surprising, but it could be that the Ukrainians are prioritizing their fighting there. And that's all I have basically for the front. I think those are the two most important areas. The other little bit of news is uh, the Americans in the Black Sea had a Reaper drone, and it was on course. It was getting close to Russian waters, and the claim is, according to the Russians, that it lost contact with its base, and it started making erratic movements, and it went suddenly in the opposite direction. Some people are speculating that the Russians are using some kind of electronic warfare that they've, with a lot of success, have used against HIMARS and against Storm Shadow missiles and JDAMs and all that kind of stuff, right? There was a successful ATACMS hit at a Air Force base in Bryansk in the Azov Sea area. This is a town just a little bit west along the coast from Mariupol. Roughly 4 helicopters have been destroyed or damaged, and an ammo depot there. And I'm guessing for a base, this would be a significant ammo depot. That too was destroyed. What other bit of news that I might be forgetting about? Yes, the 2 Su-27s from the Russian Air Force escorted a British plane that was a Typhoon that was getting too close. And I mean, that's neither. It's not that exciting, anyhow. But that's what I have for you for Ukraine battlefront news.
Concise and descriptive as always. And you brought up something that I suppose I knew, but had just slipped to the back of my mind about Avdiivka, with it being one of those primary points for the shelling of Donetsk City, something that has been making life a living hell for these people for almost a decade at this point. And on top of the symbolism of that, of course, any victory like that, any driving back the Ukrainian forces is going to be a boost in morale. I mean, even something like Bakhmut, which had, let's just say, dubious strategic significance, still led to that boost in morale. But if they can actually, even if they don't take the city anytime in the near future, let's just say, the
Yeah.
fact that they can quite literally draw fire away from the civilians in Donetsk is addressing one of the primary concerns of why this war even started in the first place.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
among the newly integrated territories into Russia, that is going to be a massive boon. Now, keep in mind that come March 2024, these areas will be officially counted in the Russian census and also be eligible to have forces mobilized from these new oblasts. So you could say that a large part of this is that they do need to secure this territory. They do need to uh, gain the confidence of the people because although I doubt Russia's going to do massive mobilization waves in the next 6, 7 months or so, if they do, and to what degree they do, they're going to need to have that confidence because, and look, I suppose you could argue might have the opposite effect if shells are falling on your home. You are more motivated to fight, but at the same time, the state apparatus that's pledged to protect you is still letting shells fall on your home. But point being is, this is something, and look, I know it's easy to sit here as somebody not in charge of any military force in any capacity, or looking back, hindsight 2020, whatever. But this is something that should have been one of the first priorities of war, stopping the shelling of Donetsk City. Because considering that, like I said, this hasn't been since February 24th, 2022. This has been going on since 2014. And it has been relentless. It has killed thousands of people, thousands of civilian men, women, and children alike, non-combatants. Has driven even more out of the area, actually into Russia proper at that point. So, if this situation can, at least, they can put a stop in it, if not outright resolve it, that is looking at something that is um, monumental. And
Yeah.
just going on the rest of the
I
front.
just
Yeah,
I
yeah, go
just
ahead.
sent you. I'm sorry to interrupt. I sent you one more map um of the situation in the north. Um they have made some gains there, but you can see at the bottom of this picture is where this heap is, and that's like from their excavation because there's a coke mine here, right? And you can see that the Russians do control an area at the bottom along the railroad tracks. The Ukrainians control the majority of it to the north of that. But if you look up to the way up to the north, there's a swoop that goes down um, with a tree line and some forest. The Russians didn't control that until recently. And the important thing is they need to control this to keep the operation in the north of Avdiivka going. Um, so yeah, that's just something I just found now.
Yes, and thank you for that. And at the end of your minutia minute, as it's become known, I always like to try to take a step back and look at the big picture of this because once again, the nitty gritty detail that shows you what's actually going on. But what I like to do is I like to zoom out from that, knowing all the
Yeah,
information we had just taken in, look at the war as a whole, and look at the just course of history in this part of the world as a whole. Just to put it in the broadest scale possible, and that is with the war in particular, at least. it does look like, with the combination of weather, the change of seasons, and frankly, shifting of global attention, things are both figuratively and literally starting to freeze over in this part. Now, I don't think it's going to become a completely frozen conflict. I don't think that there's going to be some sort of ceasefire or anything anytime soon, but we are seeing, just because of factors out of really anyone's control, that things are going to slow down for the winter. We saw this in over the course of the past winter as well. And I mean, in fact, the fact that the war didn't even start until late February, I think, is also indicative of that. And around this time, at least if memory serves me correctly, around January 2023 especially, was the big push for Kiev to have more arms, more armor, more funding from the West. Now, that has been a consistent throughout the entire war, but that's when Zelensky really went on his diplomatic offensive and was visiting all these Western countries, meeting with all these leaders, calling up people. That's actually when they secured the Leopard tanks and secured the weapon shipments, what they were able to get from Germany. So, going into the later into the fall and into the winter, it is going to be interesting to see how the Ukrainians approach this on a diplomatic front, on on more of the aspects outside of the battlefield, especially now that attention is shifting to the Middle East, and there's always the potential of East Asia becoming yet another flashpoint with many situations in East Asia, not just China and Taiwan, but also you think in particular the Korea situation, South China Sea, etc. But I do think that we'll probably see some more Russian pushes before things really start to freeze over, before things really start to stagnate for the next few months here. I'm tempted to say that you're going to see some Ukrainian attempts, but from what I've seen now, once again, I don't have all the information in the world in front of me, but from what I've seen of the Ukrainians, just given manpower resources, they are far more exhausted than the Russians. Not that the Russians are coming out of this easy by any means, but just some of the footage I've seen out of Ukraine and the tone and temperament that the Ukrainian state's taken, there is a certain level of exhaustion setting in that wasn't even present a few months ago, especially after what I can only imagine was a very demoralizing experience over the summer with how much they propagandized the summer offensive. Now, of course, once again, I don't think anyone, even the most ardent of Ukraine supporters beyond the absolutely delusional people, believed that you would have Ukrainian forces either at or in Crimea by the end of summer. I don't think anyone believed that, but even from the, let's just say, much more rational Ukrainian supporters, there were far higher expectations for the summer counteroffensive. In fact, the fact that they held on to it for so long, saying Ukraine is on a counteroffensive, before finally admitting that the counteroffensive had failed. Once again, we were like, that was a couple weeks ago. They had just conceded that no, this didn't succeed, and this is something they've been hyping since May, June of this year. And although it's to be expected, you're not going to meet all of your goals. There has to be a certain critical mass for demoralization. I know I harp on this every time I talk about the AFU, but I am left wondering, and to divorce this from the human suffering, as much as I hate to do that, just for a moment, it is a very interesting look at how much demoralization can an army take before it implodes. And I don't think the AFU is anywhere close to implosion, but it does make me wonder because although there have been some successes over the course of the war for them, it has been loss after loss. It has been mounting casualties. It has been meat grinders. It has been a very fickle wartime leadership. As much as they love to prop up Zelensky, even people on the Ukrainian side talk about what a great leader is, they're if you give any honest assessment of the situation, even a lot of pro-Ukrainian people will question the stability and the capability of the Ukrainian leadership in any real sense. They accept it because that's what it is, that's their team, blah, blah, blah. But I'm just wondering, it, are we close to a breaking point? I know I ask this question every time we discuss the AFU, and not because I think that we are, because I think it's something very important to keep in mind over the course of this war. Now, of course, I suppose you could ask the same question about the Russians, but just given the degree of manpower and the resources Russia has drawn, they have a major advantage in the simple fact that they can rotate troops, that they can
Yeah.
keep keep the men fresh in the field, stop them from becoming too demoralized. I don't know how long they're keeping men in the field before rotating, but it's certainly a significantly shorter degree than what the Ukrainians are, because the Ukrainians simply have less manpower to rotate out. And with their inefficient conscription system, they also have a lot of untapped manpower, which is as bad as not having the manpower at all, because you have it but you can't really use it. And if we're to believe that the average age of the Ukrainian soldier is around 40, like that one study said, like I said, I think that's probably either a bit over exaggerated, or there was some really clever bookkeeping on their parts, just for a variety of reasons. I'm not saying the average Russian soldier is this 18, 19-year-old kid, but it's probably younger than 40. I'd probably wager somewhere mid 20s if I had to guess, like 24, 25. But don't take my word for it in particular, as in particular, or as like a stated fact. But that would be the ballpark I would put it in. But once
Well,
again,
I mean, go
yeah, go
ahead.
ahead.
I was just going to say conscription is not actually going very well right now in Ukraine. Ukraine has now decided to put up like mobile conscription areas. So there's no more you're dragged out, you're told you have to go to the conscription office in 2 days or whatever. They're going to be right there. And they're introducing these into the streets of Kiev, Odessa. They need more men. And then they released a video of like an all woman's platoon, right? Like, you know, these women weren't, let's say, a slender, attractive young women all dolled up, wearing fatigues and so on, and
This wasn't a
bulletproof vests and
propaganda video,
helmets.
just to put it short.
No,
Yeah.
no, no. These women were a little bit older. I would say mid 20s to mid 30s, maybe even late 30s. Like insane stuff, right? So conscription is not going that well. Um, I think the Russians wanted something more than just a reconnaissance in force in Avdiivka, but like I say, this is going to be a very long battle. I would say it will take probably just as long as Bakhmut did. It will be a battle that will go on uh, probably well into February. Now,
I think it'll probably be
the thing
spring
I
before we see any conclusive results. Honestly, I'm expecting this to be, especially with winter conditions, especially with the way fall is going to be, just the time of year that this is happening. I get the feeling
yeah,
it's going to be a very long and drawn out process for
th-
the both of them.
there's going to be like 10 days, and a lot of it will depend on how much Ukraine wants to throw into Avdiivka. A lot of it will depend on that. Because just remember that all the territory that the Russians have gained there is very recent, right? Some of it is only a few weeks old. Some of it is only a month old, right? Because of an ongoing just pressure all across the front line. Uh, for instance, in the morning, I mean, I found out that the Russians, remember when Conrad and Dmitry were on,
Yeah, go on.
and I was talking about a road that Ukrainians had captured in the Robotino in the southern part. I don't mean Robotino, the town. I mean the area where it's fighting. This is an area between Verbove and Robotino. The Russians have completely retaken that road now. The bottom third of Robotino now is in a gray zone, and even Western newspapers now acknowledge that Ukraine does not control the town of Robotino completely. Definitely the top third, the top half, yes, but not the bottom. So but I think they're willing to sacrifice that because you had articles that have come out where a Ukrainian soldier was complaining that this was a pointless battle. It served nothing, and we lost so many men, so forth and so on. Right. The thing is they have to fight like this in order to gain money, and that ties into what you're talking about. What's their breaking point? Their breaking point is when the money runs out. That's their breaking point.
Yeah, I can't really disagree with that, just judging on the way this war has been conducted. And just a couple last things I want to cover about Ukraine, and I suppose tangentially related to Ukraine in the case of one of these, before we get into too much in the Israel stuff, is I do have to wonder on a couple of topics, particularly surrenders by the AFU and saboteurs behind Russian lines. And it does make me wonder. Now, I don't have the rates in front of me, I don't have solid numbers in front of me, but from what I've observed in this war, there has been far less surrender on the AFU side than what I would have expected. Where they, I mean, I would say, and perhaps my view of this is too narrow, with meat grinders like Bakhmut in particular, you would have expected having men going into a battlefield where the average life expectancy was something like 4 hours, that you would have allowed them to, at the first opportunity, would throw down their arms and spend the rest of the war in POW camp. And I mean that's not unprecedented for wars throughout history, where a lot of them
Yeah.
face just with.
Well,
Uh,
Russia has close to 10,000.
yeah, I knew that.
Ukraine. It,
Yeah, I knew that there were quite a
it's
bit
a huge number.
because they keep trading them. But that's uh, not to get too much into some of the maybe unwise decision with some of the Azov members that they captured in exchange for. But point being,
For
yeah, um, yeah, I knew that I didn't know they had as much as 10,000, but considering the number of men in the field, I frankly, and perhaps this was a bit of naivete on my part, towards the beginning of the war, expected a lot more surrenders and a lot more just abandoning of posts. Now, I think that we're well beyond that. I would wager a lot of that has to do with that there will be consequences for others that you leave behind in Ukraine, whether that be family or whoever else, if you do pursue that path, because of the way that the Ukrainian state has operated since the beginning of this war. I don't think it's unprecedented to say that a lot of men who are in the field are there because there are people that they know that are either current hostages or potential hostages, and not even in the most literal sense, but in the sense of what the Kiev regime will do to them. That what we've seen, for example, when they went into Kharkov or Kherson, in the areas that they had taken back from the Russians, or the Russians retreated from it, that they later seized. We saw the crackdowns that followed as the Ukrainians re-entered into those areas. So I would imagine, just simply because of that, that is probably why they're not surrendering. And it does make me wonder that if there are more comprehensive prisoner exchanges, how will Ukraine treat its returning POWs? Will these be people who are welcome back, or will these be people who are treated with an air of constant suspicion, if not outright acting on said suspicion? I have a feeling it's going to be the latter, where they are going to treat these men who were captured, regardless of circumstance, as if they were maybe not outright collaborators, but didn't do enough
Mhm.
to counter the Russians, and they should have accepted death before dishonor, etc., etc. But I do feel like if there is that, then if there is some sort of prisoner exchange, we could see that. And the other topic I wanted to bring up before I moved on to the Polish elections, which I promised to be very brief about because there are far more interesting topics we need to get to, is the question of saboteurs behind Russian lines. And look, as you were saying with the bridge in Gorlovka, we've seen that. There was some activity in Crimea. I believe there was actually a train derailing, and I might be mixing that up with another story. Over the past, of course, the past few weeks in Crimea, and it is inevitable when you move into these territories, even the territories you've controlled for 9 years, like Crimea, that you're going to have subversives behind enemy lines, especially in a war of this nature. But a lot of what is, at least in my opinion, and feel free to weigh in, and of course the audience also feel free to weigh in on this, is with the area in which the fighting is taking place in Ukraine, these parts of eastern Ukraine that have gone back and forth between the hands of several different nations and empires through the course of the past few hundred years, as I've gotten into many times. The people there develop a very fickle attitude towards whatever the governing state authority is. Whoever's on the up and up, that's who they're with. One day they're Russians, next year they're Ukrainians. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth is there, they're loyal to the Commonwealth, and now, of course, we're talking centuries ago at that point. But point being is, in such a volatile area that changes hands so frequently, state loyalty is eroded for a very status quo position where they favors the status quo. And it does make me wonder that contingent on Ukrainian propaganda efforts and Ukrainian performance in the war, that people behind lines see it. In particular, and now I don't doubt that there's people who view themselves genuinely as ethnic Ukrainians or view themselves as have some sort of higher ideal behind what they do, which I'd imagine that's most of the saboteurs. But you do have to wonder to a certain degree how many fair weather people are there, where maybe they think the wind is blowing in Ukraine's direction. Now, for whatever reason, they might think that. I don't know. It depends on access to information, what they see on the ground. There's many reasons why they might come to that conclusion, whether it be right or wrong. And they decide that maybe if I cooperate with whatever SBU agents are behind Russian lines or whatever else, I can get in good when Kiev's forces show back up, and especially considering the reprisals that were shown to people who quote unquote collaborated with the Russians, quote unquote cooperated with the Russians. That might be a tempting offer to some. Once again, I'm sure there's blackmail, there's hostages, there's all that kind of stuff, but I I do have to wonder, in at least the disputed territories, as it were, what is the primary makeup of the saboteurs? Now, inside Russia, I think that's a completely different story. I just want to focus on Crimea, Kherson, Zaporizhia, and the Donbass republics. That's the area I want to focus on for this. It does make me wonder who makes up this class of saboteurs and how many of them are there. Clearly, there's been enough to make an impact on the war effort. They haven't completely collapsed the Russian war effort, but there's enough where it has setbacks. And as you were mentioning with the Glorivka Bridge, that is one of many examples, and of course that's a recent one as well. And I do have to wonder what is the solution here, because you could say the Russians can take a very hardline stance towards collaborators and enemy saboteurs, much like Kiev does, but that also runs the risk of you are wanting to integrate these people into Russia. In fact, you actually have. You are wanting to proposition yourself as the legitimate government. So it does tie the Russians' hands where they can't really act like a traditional occupying force because they do view these territories as theirs. They've outright held referendums for annexation of these territories. But on the other hand, it has opened the door quite a bit to sabotage. Now, it's not as much as some people would like you to believe, but it does seem to be an endemic problem since the start of this war, and a problem that is probably going to last far longer this war. And it does make me wonder, can these people be rooted out, and if so, how, and if so, is the cost worth it?
Yeah, I mean, so far the attacks, like some of them, like the bridge is a successful attack. The vast majority are sporadic. Um, you know, when the war started, we saw a lot of government officials, like not government, I mean, these are people in civic positions, like, way back, um, in the Kherson area, or it was maybe Zaporozhye area, there was a like a gym teacher that also sat on like the town council, like this, people like this, who were being killed or maimed. And we're seeing less of those car bombings because we saw a lot of them in 2022. Now you see, but my bet is that like we don't know for sure how many of these people are actually like, I don't know. Look, it was the anniversary of the death of Motorola. um I believe Pavlov was this, Artem Pavlov. um I hope I got the last name right. But how was he killed? Well, he was killed by SBU agents that like went over. you know the problem is they can easily sneak through. Like, they they don't look any different. They probably all speak fluent Russian. You couldn't tell them apart, right? But my bet is this: that if the war stops, if it ends, if there's some kind of a Russian victory, or there's a freezing of the conflict, you're going to see even less of this. Like, it all depends on aid, right? Ukraine cannot generate any money. Big businesses, small businesses, the military, everything. America is literally funding an entire country to stay afloat, right? If that stops, all of this will stop. There's nothing that you can even bribe them with. Even if they wanted to carry out the attacks, like, they wouldn't even have the money to buy the munitions for it.
Yeah,
So
it
a lot of this depends literally just on the funding.
it really does come down to how much more aid will Congress authorize, and I don't want to get too much into it because it's a story that is over as it is already. But the dispute over the Speaker of the House position with the ouster of McCarthy, who of course was completely on board with the Ukraine project. You had this Jim Jordan guy who was allegedly going to put a freeze to funding Ukraine, which I would have believed it when I saw it, but that didn't happen. He lost two bids for it and conceded. But now that the House is going back into the hands of a quote unquote caretaker Republican, the aid's going to continue to flow. It's going to
Hmm.
continue out. And I mean, in the words of Janet Yellen, we do have money to support both war efforts. And Ukraine and Israel will both get their fair share. And as I had mentioned earlier, 60 billion has been approved to Ukraine, another 14 billion to Israel. And that's also on top of the money that they receive from other nations. And I know Europe is not in a very prosperous position as it is, but they still find time and money to scrape together and resources to scrape together to send to Ukraine. So the tap is probably going to be on for a while until they deem the project just fully unviable. But I think you're right when it comes down to it. A lot of it comes down to the fact that there is still money to throw around, so therefore there will be a war effort. And I was actually thinking about this earlier today. I don't remember the exact context that, and this is getting back to really basic stuff that I think everyone here knows, but I do think always bears repeating. That before the central banks, war efforts would dry up because you would simply run out of the money to fund them. But now that you can rack up infinite debt, wars can go on forever. And we're seeing a case of this. Now, the question is that debt level really infinite? Can you really do that forever? I think if you're in a powerful enough position, you can, which America was for the longest time. But now that the power is starting to slip, that debt becomes suddenly more real. The economic situation becomes suddenly worse. So it really is a question of how much more money can come out of the American empire's coffers for this, and how much more will they deem worthy. which is a really up in the air question considering the political climate in the U.S. Of course, there is the standard uniparty line support for Israel, support for Ukraine. We can do both. But then you listen to what they say behind the scenes, whether that's leaked or whether that's just something they put out that people don't pay attention to. You listen to what they say in the Pentagon, you listen to
Mm-hmm.
what they say at the White House. They are raising eyebrows at this, and not that I don't think we're suddenly going to get détente with Russia. We press Ukraine to concede all this territory, and then we have some sort of era of general stability for the next few years. I shouldn't say era, that oversells it, but some sort of period of relative stability for the next few years, maybe similar to the end of Vietnam and détente. One may think, but once again, the U.S. had a lot more bargaining chips to pull when Nixon did that, and I'm not just doing that to sing the praise of Nixon as much as I like him. It's just objectively the position of America in the 1960s and 70s. We had a lot more bargaining chips than we do today, and getting back to the ultimate point of this is, yeah, this war will continue so long as there are men to fight it and there are funds for it. And I suppose that brings me to the next topic of the Polish elections, which I had to be honest, the results were pretty inconclusive. Now, what we generally know is that Law and Justice, despite receiving the plurality of the vote, something around 35.6, I believe, they lost their coalition forming majority. And now people are looking to former Prime Minister and EU darling Donald Tusk, who was in charge of the center right party that was running in coalition with the left wing parties, to form a new government. And that is not certain. I mean, Duda still is in power. He's still. I believe that Duda won't be up until re-election for next year. So he is, as is in the parliamentary system, as president, is the kingmaker of these coalitions. So he very well could pull a few strings and give it to Law and Justice and let them have first shot at forming a coalition. Because these parliamentary system, a lot of it does depend on the direction of the president. Even it, you and you do see different philosophies out of this. For example, in Slovakia, where we had Robert Fico's victory, where the President of Slovakia officially respected the process, but also gave Fico an extremely small window to form a coalition, which he eventually did. But you also have Dude in the position where he could pull the strings, and depending on circumstances, I actually think that he won't pull the strings for Moraviki and Law and Justice as a whole, simply because of what the outside forces pressing down upon him are saying now that the issues have come to a front, and that he's going to allow the much more pro EU administration of somebody like Donald Tusk into power in Poland. And I, it's going to be party line with when it comes to support for the war in Poland. There was a brief pause there. There was a brief dispute there where it looked like we may have at least a curtailment of Polish support of the war effort. Now, complete cutoff was never in the question, but looking at our good friend Donald Tusk, I believe that he is going to try to smooth over a lot of the tensions that happened between Poland and Ukraine over the past few months. Despite the war
Yeah.
nearness, despite the exhaustion, if anyone has the ability to have that kind of control over the parliamentary politics of a European nation, it is somebody like Tusk, because of how much of an establishment shill that he is, how embedded he is in the system. Now it might be unfair to Tony Blair, and actually I'm not going to make the comparison. But if you had to make the comparison, forgive me everyone for saying this, he does have a Tony Blair kind of pull within at least internal Polish politics. I'm not going to give him global credit, despite his stint to the EU. Uh,
Yeah. He's a well
yeah,
established he's a well established cog in the machine. He's not Tony Blair level, He doesn't have that kind of independent power. He
No,
hasn't
no.
built it up. But I know I'm not suggesting that's what you were
Yeah,
implying.
I
But
he likes to think of himself as Tony Blair, despite the fact that he's not even close. I at least that's how I that's my gauge in the man, I should say.
mhm.
But yeah, as you said, very vital cog in the machine, and he has a lot of pull within internal Polish politics. So he can gin up the support for the war. He'll probably release the weapon shipments that Ukraine was going to curtail on, and
Oh
that
yeah,
the Polish were that Morawiecki was going to curtail on for Ukraine. In which case, that's far more invigorating for the war effort. Now, how does this affect my perennial prediction of Poland gets involved in the war? I'm not saying it's going to
yeah.
happen, but I think it becomes far more likely, honestly, under somebody like Tusk than it does even under a quote unquote right wing nationalist government. Like, I guess if you want to call Law just right wing nationalist, some people might take issue with that. In which case, yeah, I understand given their track record. But I mean, on the bright side, their migration referendum failed, so that's good for them. As frustrated as I am with nations like Poland, I don't think that they should be demographically just overturned. So there's a bit of positive news just from a cultural level at least. But when it comes to actual support for the war effort, Poland has been a vital area for support to Ukraine from both inside of Poland and outside of Poland. A lot of the main arms shipment routes go through the Polish-Ukrainian border, and now that you have someone who is, let's just say, goes less against the grain when it comes to European Union power politics, yeah, it's going to be something that is very easy to continue to support the war effort for Ukraine. So more money and more weapons will flow, unfortunately, and this conflict will be even more prolonged. And not that I think there was even a viable option in Poland to take power that would have cut off the arms shipments. The fact that the centrist coalition, as it were, is back in power is probably the worst case scenario when it comes to support for the war for people who would ideally like to see the situation come to a close and the West just butt out of it.
Well, I mean, you can well imagine what would happen. Let's say, um, remember Poland last year and part of this year was buying all those HIMARS systems. They bought hundreds of them.
Oh yeah,
Let's say Poland says, "Here, have them all." I mean, Russia would be in very big trouble. Very big trouble. As I've said on this show before, the HIMARS are good. They are good. Now, when the HIMARS were being used to just keep trying to destroy the Antonovka bridge and this over and over and over and over again, right? And the Russians got good at just like knocking them out anyways, right? Like that was a misuse of it, right? The Ukrainians have switched tactics now, and what they do is, although these systems are incredibly expensive per missile, also notice that the ATACMS that they use, the first use of the ATACMS to destroy those 4 or 5 helicopters in Bryansk, okay, they fired some. Now they were given 20, but they fired something like 17, right? Three
yeah,
got through. Three of them got through. So that means 14 were knocked down. Okay. But now you've only got 3 more missiles left, right? So you can't saturate the system. The way the HIMARS attacks have been happening, and I think people have noticed over the last month, I always bring up like, it is okay. So sometimes they waste it on an ammo depot. Again, the ordinances that they shoot are very expensive, right? And I'm guessing they lost some HIMARS systems in 2022 because if you can only shoot 18 a day and you say you have 36 systems and each system 6 multiply 6 by 36 and all you shoot are 18, you're either really salvaging them, like you're really being judicious about your use of these ordinances, or you've lost some and you're being judicious. Do you know what I mean? But let's suppose Poland decides to give like, I don't know, let's say another 20, and they have longer range missiles. Like, that's their, it's built into the escalation ladder, right? And this, I think, falls back to what we're talking about right now with the reference to, Israel. And that is, Putin did not attack Ukraine the way Israel has attacked Gaza. If he did, I'm convinced now that that was actually the right decision. After watching what happened in Gaza, I am convinced that if he had bombed Kiev like that for 2 weeks, right, where you're like 600 bombs a day, it's not 600, but some tallies have 6,000 after 12 days. Like, it's some ridiculous amount, right? One newspaper said more bombs in 10 days were dropped on Gaza than half a year were dropped in Afghanistan, right? We're talking, everybody has seen the videos. I'm sure everybody listening has seen the videos. If Russia had done something like this, I don't think even China would have supported them,
Honestly, I will
right? And
take it a
there
step
have been New
further.
York Times articles where they've said it's incredible the lack of civilian deaths, right? Remember last year, the Russians hit several targets in Kiev around September or October, and about 17 civilians were killed. Considering the kind of damage that was done, right, and considering the places that the Russians believe there were, either NATO advisors and Ukrainian generals or something of the such, or mercenaries, or the three combined, which would not be outrageous in the least to consider. Um, that's not a lot of people.
Uh, I,
It's regrettable and it's sad, but it's not a lot of people.
that actually brings me to a couple points. Point number one is this does show that with modern weaponry, like Israel has plenty of, if you want to minimize civilian casualties, these weapon systems allow for that. And if not, it's either blatant disregard or outright animus. And I think we could actually take the three examples where is Russia, a nation that is trying to reintegrate a lot of this territory, wants to be very cautious about it. American adventurism in the Middle East is more of just a disregard. They don't really care. Like, not that they're outright targeting civilians, but they don't care if they die. It's just the way it is. Israel, they outright animus. They want these people wiped off the map. Point number two. I think if Russia even did half of what Israel has done in Gaza,
Yes,
that, and I say this not even hyperbolically, NATO would have gotten involved. It would have
I
been
think
full
so.
scale war if the Russians decided to prosecute even half of what the Israelis have in the past 2 weeks. It would have been a world war.
It's very, very possible. It's possible. Maybe even very likely. I it would not have been off the table. I mean, I would think America would have given them long range missiles to the Ukrainians.
I think they would have
Hell, they
sent the
would have
weasel
launched
countries
some of
in
these
already.
under the pretext that it.
I think they would have sent in the weasel countries, Poland, Romania already, if that were the case. They would have
Yeah, I mean,
they would have had to
people would have been
escalate.
outraged.
Yeah, they would have had
Oh,
to.
they would have murdered Russians in Europe. They would have lynched them. Absolutely, they would have killed diplomats. I've no doubt on this.
Yeah, I mean,
You see the reactions going on in the Middle East right now. Embassies are closing down. There was the Turks set fire to part of the American embassy. They stormed over one of the fences. They erected Palestinian flags. Israel sent a warning saying all Israelis must leave Turkey as fast as possible. six other countries, Israel, you get the picture, right?
Yeah.
Six other countries, Israel has closed down their embassies. Like it would be a very, very serious thing, and escalation would have happened much more quickly,
I mean,
right?
and look at Latvia's current deportation program, where they are deporting people who fail to express proficiency in Latvian language. Now, I'm not going to defend them on that because I think that the premise around it is ridiculous, and I do think that there actually is a distinction between that and other, maybe the problem America has with our southern border. I've gotten into that. I will get into that, but not right now. But it's been a very orderly process. Fortunately, there hasn't been any blood spilled with it. Had like you said, the Russians did that, it would have been bloody ethnic cleansing in places like the Baltic states, in my opinion.
Oh yeah, if
Yeah,
they had done
it.
stuff like that, like I say, they would have been lynching people in Ukraine. They would have been lynching them in Europe. Uh, oh, it would have been. There's no way. There's no way. Um, and Russia would India still have supported them? No. I
Oh
mean, India
no,
isn't
no.
is would Turkey? Would Turkey have blocked American warships going? Turkey couldn't justify doing that.
Honestly, would
It,
Belarus have even stood with them at that point?
yeah, yeah,
I think so,
right.
but I think it would have been. I think we would have seen a lot more pause out of somebody like Lukashenko, who, look, I know he probably has a bad taste in his mouth from 2020, but a man's no stranger to cooperating the West and
What
trusting
would Russians
Russians.
have done?
Yeah, that's. I
What
mean,
would Russians have done? What would they have done? I mean, there would have been mass desertions. There would have been way more terrorist attacks. No, I think the Russians played this very well. However, I would say that America knows that if they can apply more pressure, Russia would have to come to a point where they decide what to do with, like, let's say a place like Avdiivka. Like Avdiivka would have to be a place that would have to be carpet bombed. You would. Now, the good thing is most of the civilians are all gone now, right? Like you look at the footage of the last 6 7 months. Yes, there were a few, on this show, like there were those 5 people trapped in Marinka, and you saw like how devastated this place was. How in the hell were 5 civilians still living in Marinka? But there were. And there were several people that were, of course, rescued in Bakhmut. Well, not several people, hundreds, right? But you look at the footage, let's say since June onwards, because the Marinka thing was, I believe, in May or early June. You look at everything from, like, let's say June the 10th onwards, like any place you see fighting, there's no civilians, right? So in Avdiivka, yes, you can see that, right? That there are civilians there, but not like to the extent that there were, let's say, last year, or certainly before 2022, right? But that would be a place that you would have to carpet bomb.
oh, absolutely.
Like if you don't take the roads, you have to carpet bomb Avdiivka. You just do. And you saw like with Mariupol. Mariupol was very bloody. Thousands of civilians did die. Um, I mean, I don't know what the number was, 2,000, 3,000. I don't know. But this was a battle that began in February and ended in May, right? In
I mean,
Gaza, after 10, 12 days, it's already 3,500 dead.
oh,
So,
absolutely. And I'm glad you brought up Mariupol because
and there was no carpet bombing of Mariupol,
no,
right?
no, no, there wasn't. I am glad you brought it up because I guess minus the carpet bombing, people have been using that for the bellwether of what modern urban warfare looks like. And with speculation about the Israeli operation into Gaza, a lot of people believe that it's going to resemble Mariupol, especially with how urbanized Gaza is. It's a massive.
It already looks like Mariupol.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, Mariupol is actually not as bad. It looks like Marinka in some areas.
Yeah, yeah. And actually, just as a brief aside, there is a YouTube channel called Videos from Mariupol that is actually just some guy who lives in the city documenting the reconstruction. Fascinating stuff. If you guys want to check something like that out, which I suppose might be a bit of a white pill considering the uh, just the absolute destruction, devastation, not only in Ukraine but in Palestine as well. But you did send the
Yeah, I'm
yeah.
sending you some images. This is what Gaza looks like.
Okay, so let me get that right here, and I suppose we'll use that to segue into the situation in Gaza right now. So these are no, don't worry. It's nothing too graphic. This is just what the landscape looks like. This is just what uh, the strip look.
These images
Yeah,
are like 4 or 5 days old. The situation is far worse now because actually yesterday the the Israelis bombed even worse than they did the first 48 hours since the this latest war began. We should also mention that, of course, the Israelis. There were two very significant strikes that took place yesterday and today. The first strike was on an Anglican hospital called the Baptist Hospital. I believe the Palestinians call it something like Al Ali.
yeah.
Um, Now there's all this debate about who did it. Like, I mean, obviously it's the Israelis that did it. This is a stupid question.
The Israelis even
Um,
said they did it as a quote unquote warning shot that if you don't get out of here, this is what Hamas is going to do to you. That's the
it's,
that's the
like,
brazenness these people have.
yeah, yeah, exactly. So I remember 2 days before there was a report that 15 hospitals were already destroyed or damaged anyways, right? The El Quds hospital years ago, the Israelis bombed anyways. Like, there's nothing like this isn't out of character. I don't know why people like. But then they got into the nitty gritty about this bomb, right? And they say, well, how come there wasn't that much destruction, right? Where's the crater? Okay, so a couple of things to understand. A JDAMS is not a bomb. It's a weapons system that you attach to a bomb to make it into a gliding bomb. The Russians have their gliding bombs, for instance, right? And they've used them very effectively. It's sadly, it's one of the reasons why the Ukrainians are having a difficult time conscripting because they're running out of men because of these. Now, the JDAM can be outfitted with different bombs because it's basically like a guidance system that attaches itself to the bomb. If it's a what do they call it? A thermobaric. If it's a
Yeah,
thermobaric bomb, it actually explodes above the ground and goes out. Now, in the video footage that I've seen, and a good account for people to follow is Lord Bedo, Bedo. He does have a Twitter account and he does have a Telegram account. Um, Great video, just about 7 minutes long. Every car in the parking lot has a depressed roof. The pressure is coming down, right? What this is like the Russian toss system. It it like sucks the air out of people. Yes, the people that the bomb falls on is going to shred them. It's going to obliterate some of them. And nothing of them will even exist. But uh, there's not as much damage as what you would appear. Like, for instance, the photos that I showed you. Okay, those those JDAM bombs are like bunker busters. What they do is they fire two of them at the base of the building, and we've seen dozens and dozens of videos of these buildings collapsing on themselves. Right? That's not what was used here. If it was either ordinance, Hamas does not have access to those ordinances. And we've already established that there's nothing uncharacteristic about the Israelis doing this. They're not the most moral army in the world, right? Uh, they have very few restrictions. They
are you
have
telling me
some.
that conservative talk radio lied to me?
So, and of course, the other thing we should mention is today they did finally attack one of the oldest churches in all of the Middle East. Definitely, I think it's the oldest one in the Levant. It's a Greek Orthodox church. Can you help me out, Constantine? What's the name of it? Saint Paisis?
Um, no, here I'll pull it up now. I will say, fortunately, I'll get the good news out of the way. That the church itself was not destroyed, but an appendix building of the church was destroyed, and there were hundreds of casualties. That is Saint uh, Porphyrios.
Porphyrios, that's right.
Yes.
Yes, over 125 dead is what I last heard. Of course, we're waiting for verification on that. Um, but yeah, so there's nothing out of the ordinary. The hospital was already told. Even the Archbishop of Canterbury was told that they were going to hit it, right? This idea that the Israelis didn't do it. And of course, Twitter and Telegram channels devoted to the Israeli state laughed about it, rejoiced about it. If you're in Telegram and you go, to some of the pro-Russian accounts like I do, you're always going to find people celebrating when there's a baby that's been killed. They just celebrate, right? That's just the way they are. If there's anything about this war, is it showed just how genocidal these people are, right? Like they are everything that they criticize. They are everything that they are no better than Hamas, right? No better. And in fact, they sponsored groups like not Hamas itself. I mean, they have sponsored them. They have literally sponsored
Yeah,
them.
yeah, they have, but pretty much every other Muslim Brotherhood organization, every neighboring country, whether that be Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Egypt, they've been they've been backing them for decades at this point.
Yeah,
I mean, the only difference between the Muslim Brotherhood and the conservatives, at least as far as the American perspective is concerned, is their opinion on Israel. And when it comes to the Middle East, pretty much everywhere outside of Israel and Palestine, the Mossad and the Muslim Brotherhood are arm in arm. It's you've never seen anything like it.
yeah.
So
I mean, we know the story. We mentioned it last time. This is because the Israelis supported them because they wanted to create a wedge in Palestinian society between the PLO and Hamas. Because Hamas is, well, I mean, they say they should have all the land. Like they don't want a two-state solution, or at least not in the 80s and 90s. That's not what their rhetoric is now. I don't know what their official rhetoric is now, but that's not what the rhetoric was even in the early 2000s. PLO, of course, was, they were part of the Oslo Accords 1 and 2, right? Um, so, you know, um, they were working on a two-state solution. Of course, the Israelis are not interested in a two-state solution. They don't want one. Uh, and that's why there's been so much expansion of settlements, illegal settlements, and the Americans don't do anything, or they pretend they try to do something. But um, the the level of, like, they're no different in their level of savagery, and like, as an Orthodox Christian, I've watched these people support terrorists in Syria for years, right? um Israel literally bombs Damascus on Christmas Eve every year, except last year. Remember, I had that tweet way back in 2019 because it was based on a tweet I did in 2018. And
yeah,
my tweet was on the 23rd. I said tomorrow, and I had a screen cap from the year before. Tomorrow, I kept that screen cap because I knew Israel would do this. This is what I mean. It's nothing out of character for these people. So I said tomorrow they will bomb Damascus, just the way they did the year before on Christmas Eve.
and
It's
you know how
symbolic.
you know how spiteful they are with that, and I'm sure you know, but I don't know if our audience does that. They they would bomb Damascus both on Christmas Eve on the Gregorian and Julian calendar.
Yes, yes.
Because yeah,
And
there's a
that
lot of
tweet
Catholics
that
in
tweet
Syria too.
exploded.
Yeah.
That tweet exploded. I had Israelis, Jews coming at me, private messaging
Oh,
me, like they were furious. It was one of the best tweets I ever had. Like it was the only tweet I had that had over 1,000 likes.
yeah,
My tweets, I was lucky if I got 50, right?
yeah,
Like that. Oh my, I mean, because I called it, right?
yeah.
I think that
Every
drove
year.
them crazy.
It,
People hate it when other people say, I know you, and they say, no, you don't. And then you say, yeah, actually, I do. I just proved it. That drives them insane. But then there's a crazy, crazy video that just emerged today of a Likud party member who was an RT and he lost his mind. He literally said, you know, we're going to defeat Hamas. And then after that, we're going after you. You're responsible for this. We're going to make sure once we win in Israel that Ukraine wins. And you're seeing this overlap, right? You're seeing this overlap between Ukraine and Israel. Biden said that they're both fighting for democracy. You had those two Ukrainian soldiers saying, "Why are there still so many Jews coming into um, into Ukraine?" It's like because that's who you're fighting for, dude. Um, Even though the Russians have been attacking Uman, okay, that's the Jewish area. I think we know where the lines are now, right? What like it's becoming abundantly clear. Tobias fled, well, and he went to the United Arab Emirates. Well, he actually went and bought food at United Arab Emirates and brought it back to Israel, right? Because that's his loyalty. His loyalty is Israel, right? The head rabbi of Russia from Moscow, he had a heart attack. He's alive, but he had a heart attack from dancing. Um, he was dancing in anticipation of Israel's revenge on Hamas.
you
It
can't
was
make this
up
up.
all. I'm not kidding you. This
I
is
know.
like from an
I saw it.
Israeli
I saw it. I saw the
Israeli
com.
paper. You
Yeah.
saw that, right?
Yeah. Oh, of
Like,
course.
so you know where their loyalties are. You know where their loyalties are, right? Um, they're not Russians, okay? The average Chechen is more patriotic than them.
And look,
Um,
I'll just say this much. Whatever degree of cooperation existed between the post-Soviet Russian government and the Jewish oligarchs, that is very quickly eroding, if not completely eroded, especially after this.
it's done.
Yeah.
It's
Like I
done.
said,
It's
I'm
done.
not denying that ever existed, but yeah, that bridge has been burned, and I think this is just definitive proof of that.
That's what this interview was about. That's what it was all about, you know. And you're looking at Israel and elite Jews around the world just not really being mindful of their own narratives, right? You remember I keep bringing up this video that happened on Russia One, where the woman says because they're not even like this is their own thing that happened to them. So like, they train Azov with the Canadians before the war. Okay, they bring Azov soldiers into Ukraine, right? Um, you know, like the streets leading to the Babi Yar memorial were not all the victims were Jews, by the way. Like only half. Where about 70,000 civilians were killed. Then it got turned into a Jewish memorial, and there was anger, about how could the Soviets ignore this. There was a battle. There was a debate over whether more recognition should have been made to the Jewish victims there because they represented the majority of the victims, right? And even Shostakovich had a symphony that I believe he did a musical score for a Soviet poet that complained about this in one of the newspapers, right? Anyhow, um, but the thing is they never took care of their own narrative because now the roads leading to Babi Yar are like, you know, Ulica Bandera and Ulica Shishkevich, right? Like these are the guys who killed them, right? Like
I mean,
They
I
don't
think I
care,
said this.
right?
I think I said
They
this
literally
last time you were on.
forfeited all of this and said, we got to kill Russia. We got to kill Russia. So it doesn't matter.
I think
And
I
that's
brought.
what we've seen.
Yeah, I brought this up last time you mentioned this, and that you're allowed to be as rhetorically anti-Semitic as you want if, when the chips are down, you make the right call. It's
Right.
that simple. Like you can say what you want. You can have the worst optics in the world, but if you are on the right side of it, and I don't think this is a profound statement by any means. Yeah, you can have that. You can have all the bad optics. I mean, honestly, in many ways, it reminds me of ISIS in Syria. So long as you are committing acts of terrorism against Syrians and not Israelis, it's fine. You can
Yeah.
have all the Islamic aesthetics and bad optics you want. It's so long as you apologize when one of your mortar shells lands in Israel. That's the only
Yeah, pretty
requirement.
much.
But yeah, I'm glad you had brought that up. But it is, and I suppose to turn it over to the United States and the Western world more broadly speaking, when it comes to support for Israel. What the elite, who just so happen to be of a Jewish background, I suppose we'll say, the amount of falling in line that has taken place, I have not seen anything like it in my entire life, at least. And I know that's not much of a gauge to go on, but there has been a complete top-down diktat that Israel's security is on the line, Israel's sovereignty is on the line. We have to stand with them. We have to give them their billions of dollars, and they have full license to end the Palestinian issue as you wish. So you had just sent me this. Biden's request to Congress includes 14 billion for Israel, 60 billion for Ukraine, 10 billion for whatever they consider humanitarian aid, 7 for the Indo-Pacific region, and 14 billion for border security. The biggest shock there is that border security is getting equal attention to Israel, but of course, no less than Ukraine. But yeah, that actually is shocking. But getting back to it, that there is a complete top-down support for Israel. You had a resolution to send aid to Israel, co-sponsored by 99 senators, 99 out of 100 senators. Now, the one dissenter you might be curious who that is Rand Paul, who, despite my departure from libertarianism, I was just saying this the other day, that Ron Paul and Rand Paul I will always appreciate as voices of sanity on a number of issues. Like I said, you don't even have to have the love affair with libertarianism that I think many of us had to recognize that. And on top of 99 co-sponsors, received 97 votes with three with three abstaining, which makes me wonder who are the two that co-sponsored this but didn't. I bet it was Bernie Sanders. Honestly, I'm gonna co-sponsor the bill and then not vote. I it's yeah, that's probably it. I'm sure the logs are out there, but that is the level of domestic support they had. Biden, of course, was in Israel, pledging his support for that, but also saying that don't attack Gaza too hard because we need to keep the base united at home. And something that you've seen, and footage of this has been rampant, especially out of American university campuses, about these pro-Palestine demonstrations. Now, it's made up of the typical crowds that you would see, let's just say, very multicultural and diverse on top of very left-wing and blue hair. Like I said, the kind of people that you expect to find in an American university. But all of these include the crowd of usual suspects supporting the leftist cause, which, I mean, I'm not saying that Palestine is exclusively a leftist cause, but it, much of the grassroots left, as we can call it, supports it. The whole decolonization thing, you guys get the point. But all these videos are always matched by either some Jewish professor or some Jewish student, faculty, whatever, who is just shrieking at the top of their lungs like their life is. It's
Yeah.
I laugh because not that I think it's funny, but there's no other reaction. But it's just so typical. Oh, my life is in so much danger because I mean the old joke is they saw some things for free and that that makes them start hyperventilating. But I digress. Um, but this has been the response within the United States. Now, like I said, from anyone who actually matters, it's pro-Israel all the way. Sure, there'll be the finger wagging, like, oh, don't do too much. Don't do too much ethnic cleansing in Gaza, but you can do a little, not too much. But that, I mean, it's a foregone conclusion that within the United States, from anyone who is of any significance, that Israel has a blank check to finish the 70-year-old, almost 80-year-old question. And I mean, I just want to put this in perspective. Since somebody pointed this out on Twitter the other day, I wish I could remember who it was. That if you want to gauge of how long this conflict has been going on, Joseph Stalin was still alive when this conflict started. That is how long this has been going on. Um, but with that being said, it does seem that I think it was actually wrong in one of my assessments I had made previously. Now, I'm not going to renege entirely on this, but I am going to backpedal on this statement, admittedly, that the diaspora are still very dedicated to Israel. Even the most liberal of the diaspora are still very dedicated to Israel, even regardless of their personal problems with Likud or the Israeli right. Yeah, they're in on it. They have not parted ways. They have not cut themselves off from it. Certainly not. And this has been a great moment of unity for them. And it has really drawn both figurative and literal battle lines when it comes to this. Now, I don't know if you have anything to say about the more
Mm.
domestic or Western situation, but I do want to get into some of the news about Jordan and Egypt and their response to this, especially with the question of the Palestinian diaspora. But I don't know if you have.
The only thing I'll say is a few points about Biden's speech. He said something about it's important not to fall into rage. He said, I told Benjamin, Israel that it's important to watch rage after 9/11. America fell into rage and shouldn't have like this two-state solution for Palestine, and it's all this just nonsense that he doesn't mean at all, right? And the most hilarious shit was Kirby and Blinken behind Biden on his plane, and he's talking to the press, and Kirby's like making these eyes like he's terrified what might come out of his mouth, and Blinken keeps like looking from around the corner. His face pops up once in a while, right? Like, we're gonna have to move him along. We have to move him along. It's all men. I
Especially
mean,
especially with Blinken, it looked like one very infamous propaganda poster. If you know,
I'm not sure I know.
I don't know about a certain long-nosed man hiding behind a curtain, watching out
No,
mischievously.
oh my
But
god, oh my god.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
great optics, guys. Number one, and I will add, you remind me of one point in the Biden speech. He was talking about the significance and the importance of Israel. He was talking about Israel was born as a safe haven for the Jewish people, and then he very much slurred his words. And I guess if you want to have the best interpretation for Biden, he said that's why it was born, but it sounded. And
Yeah.
I slowed this down to like 0.25 speed to listen. It sounded like that's where I was born. So
Yes, it did. It sounded like he said that's where I was born. It's like I mean, I suppose now I can say that all those times he said like I'm Jill Biden, like, or you remember when we thought he was saying something about when he was on the campaign trail?
yeah.
Didn't it sound like I'm Jill Biden, but he was saying I'm Joe Biden? Because the problem is he slurs his words so badly that you know
Look,
you
if he was born in Israel, mind you, before Israel was even established as a state, that makes sense why he
yeah.
was going to yeshiva with all his Jewish friends.
Those children are married to Jews. But the other thing I love is, he did say that one time he was giving a speech at the university, and he said he was a professor.
Yeah.
And that guy from the Duran, Alex Christoforou, from time to time he calls him Professor Biden. Professor Biden. And also Pirate Schultz. Remember Pirate Schultz
Oh,
when
of
he
course.
got a black eye and he claimed that he was jogging and fell down? It's like, nah, you did. That's not what happened. Somebody beat the F out of you, and they did it because you were being slow about, like, something was going wrong about the war in Ukraine, and something you didn't want to do, and they just beat the hell out of you, and you submitted. That's all it is.
I mean,
It's like when they beat up Bernie, you're gonna show up at her speech, and you're gonna. I don't want to hear you complaining about.
can we just make the show about the Freemason and Illuminati cabals that like beat up new initiates?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But you know
That's
what? One thing I will say about the Israeli conflict. Can I just
yeah.
say
Yeah.
this?
No. No. Go ahead.
I
Go ahead.
I promise it won't be more than 5 minutes. There was an excellent interview that took place between. Okay, it was George, no, Alexander Mercurius, uh, that I believe Norwegian professor Kaiser, I forget his name, much younger than these two, but Alistair Crook was on the show. Christoforou was not there, so it was just Alexander Mercurius, okay? It's like 3-4 days ago, maybe 4 or 5 days ago now. And Alistair Crook explained the situation. So, like, way back after 9/11 happened, I really started to pour into, the conflict in Israel, why it was happening, the importance of the Dome of the Rock, uh, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, why it's so significant, where was the temple, right? And just so people know, like, up until the Schofield Bible and yours truly, Constantine and I are not, we're not Schofield Christians, we're not American Christians, we're not Zio Christians, right? Just so you know. The eschatology is very simple, right? Like, you crucified the Lord, you're going to lose everything. Your temple, all the genealogy, all of that is going to go. Your priesthood, your state, your king, it's all gone, right? That's the whole point when the apostles, when Christ says to the apostles, not stone, pointing to the temple, not stone, not one stone will remain upon another, right? And in 70 AD, that was fulfilled, and it was the end of it. But Alistair Crook, he's a very intelligent man, very salient, very articulate, and obviously has a very deep pool of knowledge. So what he explained was this: the protests that were happening against Bibi Netanyahu, okay, uh, those protests were mainly led by Ashkenazi Jews. These are the ones with much more like European admixture. Okay,
These are your
there's what
German
you would
Eastern
call white
European
Jews.
Jews.
Right, right. The Mizrahi, maybe there's some Sephardics amongst them, but in any case, like the darker Jews with, mixed Arab descent. Okay, uh, these Jews are actually a conservative bloc. The upper generals are mostly Ashkenazi, and they were also on the side of the protesters. The white Jews are also liberal. They're
Wait, the
more
what?
liberal. Okay. Hmm?
What did you just call them?
The white Jews or the Ashkenazi Jews. Yeah. Well, I mean, it's pretty apparent.
No, I
Like,
I know, I know. I just I obligatory.
yes. Okay. So they the conservative push to rewrite the Israeli judicial system, which was, kind of based on the American one that's divided into three equal parts. Like what Benjamin Netanyahu wants, ostensibly, okay, is to empower the Mizrahi Jews. I'm probably slaughtering the name of it. I'm sorry, but he wants to empower them because these people don't want to even think about a two-state solution. They want to drive them out. This is a much more conservative force than the Ashkenazi European-based Jews. Much, much more, right? Also notice, remember the first show that we did last week, that a lot of the senior military officers that were killed, some of them killed with their families right away, those were Ashkenazi Jews. And there's a debate, like how did they find them so quickly? Right now, it could be, well, their upper command, they got infiltrated, and that's how it happened. But it's an important question to ask. Now, to get back to Alistair Crook, so what he's basically saying is this: it's the conservative elements within Israel that want to bring back the sacrifice to the temple, but the temple has to be reconstructed first, right? The way to do that is you have to destroy the Al-Aqsa Mosque. You have to destroy it, right? But that will cause an immense war for that to happen. Okay, and it is this that's kind of what's going on behind the scenes, right? In small steps. This is what the most conservative elements within Israel want. It's not going to happen tomorrow, but like, put yourself in my place. In 2003, I was talking to people about this as I found out, right? And at the time, it seemed far-fetched, and there would be the odd story of Jews or evangelical American Christians trying to blow up the bottom of the Temple Mount, right? It's important to understand that Temple Mount is just that. It's a mount. The temple is gone. This is just like kind of like a pedestal, if you will, on which the temple stood. And so anyways, hear the talk before I belabor the point. It was on the Duran with Alistair Crook, and it's amazing. I was spellbound. I had no idea this man knew anything about this, and like I say, it was an education to listen to him.
Yeah, gonna have to listen to that one. It's one of those things that always gets pushed to the backlog. It's just, but yeah, I'm actually fascinated in that now that you do say that, and yeah, even within Israel, even within the ethno state of ethno states, it is an interethnic conflict. It's you, you,
Yeah,
you
there have
can't
been
run
videos
away
of
from it.
one of the women who escaped, the young woman, 19,
Yeah.
who's very upset with him. Like I say, there's I mean, and the state of things is just crazy, right? Like there's still all those hostages. Over 300 Israeli soldiers have been killed. Over 1,400. Like it is a big deal for the Israelis. This was huge. It's it's the biggest thing that they've ever faced.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's a day of humiliation. It's the undoing of 1967, the undoing of 1973, and I don't think that's being hyperbolic at all. The
Hmm.
wars in which Israel proved itself as a, well, quote unquote, proved itself as a viable state. We all know where the backing came from with that, but
One of the things that it's also proven is the Israeli tactic of streaming porn has not worked. Because I don't know if people know that,
oh,
but when
yeah,
Ramallah was under attack many years ago, they would stream porn, and then when the Canadians, when the Americans invaded Iraq, they did the same thing, right, to pacify the people, but it didn't it didn't work in Gaza. My God.
it did not. And what is what is interesting is what you brought up about the 2002 case. They did that in Ramallah and the West Bank. Now, I imagine they probably tried to also do it in Gaza, but I think it does show the fundamental divide between the two, despite being one people, one nation. That just the absolute hellish conditions of Gaza has created a much more militant population, to say the least, out of it. And I think the other, to continue on with the news out of Israel, the other real big development with this, and I'll get into some of the wider stuff with Iran and the missiles that were allegedly launched from Yemen that were intercepted by the U.S. and the potential for a wider conflict. But I do just want to get into the question of both Egypt and Jordan first. So, as I'm sure you all heard, there has been an ongoing dispute with Egypt to open up the evacuation routes from Gaza to the Sinai. Now, Egypt has been resistant because if they let the Palestinians out, they're not going back because the Israelis will not let them back in. And while there aren't a lot of civilians at stake, it is. I mean, it's the position that Israel wants both the Palestinians and the Arab world in. Do you keep these people in and leave them as potential victims to our scorched earth campaign, or do you let them out knowing that they are going to be a permanent part of your country, a permanent fixture, whether that be in Egypt, Jordan, wherever, and we are going to seize this land for the Israeli state, and that they will most likely never see it again. So there has been disputes with that. There have been massive demonstrations on the streets of Jordan demanding that the crossings in the West Bank be opened up. I mean, once again, massive Palestinian diaspora in Jordan. Now, I guess you could make the argument that within the Levant, it's especially between Palestinians and Jordanians, it really is one nation. But I don't want to get too deep into that question right now. But there has been demands to open up the crossings and actually let the Palestinians back into the West Bank as a result of this. And mind you, a key part of Israeli security going into the 21st century, the reason we have the entire clean break memo, uh, 5 countries in 7 years or 7 countries in 5 years, can never remember which one it is that Israel felt secure in its southern and eastern flank. It was unsecure in its northern flank, particularly with the question of Lebanon and Syria and their ties to the Iranians. But while you haven't had the deterioration of relations with Egypt to the same degree as other Arab and Muslim states, you have with Jordan. And we'll get into later, you have with Turkey. And I believe you even had it with some of the Gulf states, even Oman, which has been a traditional mediator between all of the Middle Eastern states. It has been the place where peace summits happen. It has been the go-between for Saudi and Iranian negotiations for years, but I'll return to that later. The Jordanians, now, they roll over. They are very uh, pacified people in many ways, where they'll allow the Americans and Westerners in general to run bases out of Jordan. They will cooperate with the Iranians when convenient. They go with the direction of the wind. They're very, once again, fair weather people. But the masses have taken to the street and have made it known to the regime there, which is still the Hashemite kingdom. You still do have the monarchy there that at least claims direct descent from Muhammad, but I I don't necessarily doubt that genealogy, but I've actually never looked too much into that, but it's not really relevant to the point right now. But with the way, especially in a lot of these Middle Eastern Arab states, masses of the population showing up on the street, especially after the Arab Spring, even though the Arab Spring wasn't exactly grassroots movement, it still is apply. But the imagery of masses on the street marching and demanding action of the government is something that does put pause in a lot of Arab leaders. which does push them to make actions that they may not have otherwise. Now, I don't believe the Jordanians are going to go to war with Israel or are going to even escalate the situation too much, but Israel's eastern flank is significantly less secure after the actions of the past 2 weeks, and any diplomatic progress that has been made with Jordan has been set back decades. Egypt, the situation isn't nearly as bad, but it has been set back at least a decade. It's been set back years, and because keep in mind, Egypt's one of the few Arab countries that actually does recognize Israel, and this is like pre-Abraham Accords. This was, I believe, 1979 is when they normalized relations, but those relations have always been very volatile. It has always been one crisis away from returning back to very hostile relations. Now, Egypt has not canceled normalization. Egypt has not pulled back on normalization, but they have been very displeased with the situation, especially considering the fact that they're going to have to bear the brunt of the majority of the Palestinians that actually do manage to get out of Gaza before the campaign starts. And Egypt is a country, it's not a poor, rundown country by any means, but I would say it's certainly second world if we're going to still use that terminology. And bringing in, what is it? How many, like 2 million Gazans is the most, but bring in at least tens, of, if not hundreds of thousands of Gazan refugees into territory, into the Egyptian territory, is going to be a large strain on them. And that's not something they can afford. And once again, also just talking from the geopolitical standpoint, it is them effectively signing the Palestinian state out of existence if they do this. It's the situation that Israel wants, where it is that rock and a hard place. They have to choose either between you refuse to help the Arab civilians or you throw the Palestinian cause under the bus, in which case you lose a lot of leverage over Israel and you embolden the position of Israel as it is.
Yes.
And once again, I've heard conflicting reports on what the Egyptians are going to do in terms of opening the evacuation corridors. Israel has been very hesitant with engaging in the ground operation in Gaza. In fact, they used the excuse of weather, of rain, that I can tell you, as somebody who stalks the radar day in and day out, and not just for the
Yeah.
U.S., not just for my region, worldwide, I love to stalk the radar day in and day out. That rain did not happen. That
No.
was a
It was
complete
never it was
excuse.
never even cloudy.
No, it was out of everything they could have said to delay the offensive, but it is going to, on the offensive, be a very costly operation. It's going to be urban warfare in an area where Hamas, or I don't even want to say Hamas at that point, because if you have the IDF enter into Gaza, it's a war with the people of Gaza, with Palestine. Now, Hamas might be the main vector of resistance for that, but certainly not every man who would be fighting back against an IDF incursion would be part of Hamas. And it's one of the youngest populations in the world. Something like 50% of the population is under 18. There's estimated, I think, about 500,000 of that would be young males in particular. Now, not all of them are going to be engaging in active combat, but that still is a large pool of potential combatants you could have when it comes to Gaza. And as they go in, as they engage in this operation, as tensions flare, that makes every fighting age man a potential target, in which case the Israelis will take full advantage of that when it comes to exacting extreme force in Gaza. But the ground operation, once again, has yet to happen, and
Yeah.
I think we can all admit that both sides have spent decades planning for this exact moment. And just a matter of,
I
yeah, go ahead.
I mean, I think there were many intermediary steps that led to it. One could say that maybe it was obvious since 2014. Uh, Mind you, Israel has gone into Gaza at least 6 times since 2000, right? And they've incurred losses. But the thing is that when they incur like the last time they went in a big way might have been in 2014, might have been in 2021. They lost about 147 guys, okay? And they pulled out, right? This is why I think they've been reiterating over and over again for the Israeli public. They're preparing them for a very large and prolonged war. 155 millimeter armaments that were ordinances that were supposed to go to Ukrainian artillery divisions have been rerouted now and are going to Israel. So it does look like they're going to go in, right? I also think that the attack on the hospital has been like, there has been speculation about why why did they do it just before Biden landed. Speculation was that Biden was, because he was supposed to go to Jordan and he was supposed to meet with I guess King Abdullah, as well as the Abbas, the head of the Palestinian Authority, the president of the Palestinian Authority. And I think maybe Israel felt like we cannot have a ceasefire. And that essentially ruined any chance of a ceasefire. That was one speculation. A more far out speculation is maybe the Israelis wanted it and the Americans did it because the Americans want to go them on. I think that's much more unlikely, given, let's say, the character of these two countries. But in the broader scheme of things, yesterday was a day that sanctions for various missile systems that were barred from Iran were ended. And now, like, I remember 2 weeks ago, there was an Israeli minister that gave a speech basically saying that he believes that eventually Russia is going to give hypersonic missile technology to Iran. And that would change things a lot, right? Like him or hate him, and I think most people hate him, Lindsey Graham, suggested destroying the 4 oil processing plants of Iran as soon as possible, preemptively, right? The possibility of this engulfing a much larger region, dragging in far more countries in a very hot war is really there. One of the reasons why maybe the Israelis haven't gone in is I don't think they're confident about what Hezbollah is going to do, because Hamas has at best 40,000 soldiers. Hezbollah has well over 3 times that. And they have much more sophisticated weapons than does than Hamas. That isn't to say that Hamas is incapable, right? The missiles that we saw this year are stronger than those that we saw in May 2021, obviously. Obviously, they show that they can oversaturate the Iron Dome system. Ascalon has been and Serdot have been completely evacuated. Ascalon is quite a bit north of the Gaza Strip. Okay. 10 Merkava tanks have been destroyed. 7 were destroyed the first day. 3 were destroyed by Hezbollah on the border with Lebanon, right? And about a dozen armored personnel carriers were destroyed. Now, some of that material was taken by Hamas into Gaza. We're supposed to suppose, right? And there's all kinds of stuff that's being revealed. There was an Israeli that I saw today on Telegram who was saying that one of the areas, one of the gates that they were attacked, which resulted in many deaths of Israeli soldiers. The screens went black on all their monitoring devices. So, what caused that? Now, just to let everybody know, History Legends has come out with 3 banger videos on the Israeli Gaza Strip war that is happening right now, and I urge you to see them. They're very, very well done. I just have one caveat, and one of the gates, um, you can see the automatic machine gun that is placed on the top of the tower actually take out 2 or 3 guys on motorcycles, and the rest of the motorcycle gang retreats. So not all those towers were taken down. That could be beneficial in understanding the powers, or even the kind of technology that was used to shut down the monitoring system, because the Gaza wall is very sophisticated, right? Like, Israelis would have to patrol this day and night, right? That's why they modernized it with AI. That's why they have like sensors that go underground to stop them from building tunnels, and so on and so forth. So I would say watch those videos. You'll receive an education in this war. But
Yeah, absolutely.
you can see that there's a broader context that's developing. I think Israel knows that if it goes into Gaza, Hezbollah will launch much more severe ordinances than what they've been doing so far. They've knocked out 3 different radio stations there, along with the Merkava tanks. That isn't to say that Israel hasn't fought back. It has. It has already bombed and taken out some Hezbollah fighters there as well. Uh, but Hezbollah is, I mean, they're really prepared for this, I think. Um, so it's going to be very interesting to see what happens. Of course, Russia will benefit the longer this war goes on, because we spoke about money and how important money is to keep Ukraine afloat. But more important is munitions. And Russia produces 7 times as many munitions as America, Europe, South Korea, the entire West combined. So Ukraine can get money to keep it afloat, but Ukraine still has a munitions problem. For instance, those attacks on Kherson that they did not begin with a cannon barrage as what is normally done. It's what they did in Rabotino. It's what Russia did in taking Bakhmut, or any movement, or the land that they took around Kupiansk, right? What they did was use FPV drones. The reason they did it is because there's just nothing else, right? They just don't have enough. So that's just something to consider.
Oh, absolutely. And I saw already the headlines that aid that was, particularly material aid, ammunition that was bound for Ukraine was redirected to Israel.
Yeah,
And you had Biden, after he got back to the White House, giving some canned speech about how the patriotic American worker, all these years later, is still the arsenal of democracy, and that, of course, Ukraine and Israel are both fighting for democracy.
that's right.
It's,
Yeah, Ukrainian
yeah.
television had a host that was talking about how um, the Palestinians are orcs, just like the Russians. Their children are raised as savages, and so on and so on. What's hilarious is you can find videos of like Palestinians telling their kids, like, "What are you going to do when you grow up?" "Oh, I'm going to kill Israelis." And you'll find Israeli children who repeat the same lines. They've literally been raised the same way. I mean, would it be normal for people to suspect that wouldn't happen in a area that's been in conflict for 75 years? Of course, it would be like this, and of course, both sides would be like this.
Oh yes, and I mean, isn't quite as severe, but you see similar rhetoric from India and Pakistan. Like I said, it's not a one for one, but you do see the same level of vitriol when you do have these generational disputes. And
Have you seen some of the Twitter posts
of course I have.
with India and Israel? There's one of like this big lion,
Do not
which
touch
is it, which is
Israel. Hold on, I'll
which
get
is
it.
India, and a lion cub, which is Israel. It's also the lion cub is roaring, and it says, "Don't you dare touch him." It's
Yeah.
like
Uh,
imagine India thinking it's the senior partner. Like it's oh my God,
I
it's
will tell
so
you
cringe.
what it actually reminds me of. Here I'll post it first. So let me get this up because I'm sure you've all seen it, but I have an obligation to share this while we're derailing the show. No, this is not a derailment. This is the most important part of the show. Believe me. And okay, so there, there it is. In all caps, do not touch Israel with big India lion and little Israeli cub. And
Oh my
I'll tell you
God,
the
it's so
voice I read
cringe.
this in my head. I was trying to do it earlier, but I kind of botched it. If you've ever seen those videos where people take on the scam callers from India regarding the gift cards and they shout, do not redeem," whenever like somebody threatens to redeem the gift cards, that's the voice that I read this in my head.
I'll tell you how fixated these people are in this with a real life story. This is anecdotal, and it had happened to me. Okay, so my friend's soon-to-be ex-wife is Bangladeshi, and she's Hindu Bangladeshi, and she has all the same opinions that a woman in India would have, like what many in India would have. I don't want to say they all think exactly this. All Hindus in India think exactly the same, of course. However, I noticed that during the good years before the marriage started falling apart, they said something. She said something like, "Oh, I hate Muslims and I hate the Chinese," right? And she goes, "I like Jewish people," right? And and also gay people are nice. So it'd be like literally. But she also hates white people. And anyways, so she did her 23andMe and she got back 1% Jewish. Oh my God. Like in the interest of my friend, I don't argue with her, right? Because his life is hard enough with her. In any case, she says, Gran, would you know anything about this? Like 1% Jewish. And I'm trying to explain to her, like, well, if it's Ashkenazi, right? Ashkenazis are generally 40 to 45% European, right? So like I don't know how strong this 1% is. Like maybe you're 0.5% Jewish. Like these, it doesn't it means almost nothing. Like but she was just so thrilled that like here's this Hindu woman that she might be it's mind-boggling. I have never seen a bigger simp nation in my life. It just I'll never forget that. So every time I see these memes, I always think of her.
I'm glad we had that aside, but there's one last major topic regarding Israel, and actually for the show that I did want to bring up, and that is the missiles that were supposedly launched from Yemen and the potential for escalation in all of this. Now, when this all started, the Houthis in Yemen made a statement that they unequivocally stand with the Palestinian resistance and are ready to send fighters to engage against Israel. Now, the Houthis have been in with the Iranians, have been supplied by the Iranians for years now. And there were allegedly, now the source is very dubious on this, I will have you know, allegedly missiles launched towards Israel's direction from Yemen that were intercepted by U.S. ships. And you were discussing with the expiration of the arms sanctions on Iran that cooperation with Russia and China for hypersonic missiles is likely in the near future. And that's assuming the Iranians don't have the capability to build their own. Now, I would imagine it's more a problem of sourcing material and parts at that point because the Iranians are not stupid people. And on top of that, they also have a very competent intelligence network. They have conducted a great degree of industrial espionage, and that has actually kept them competitive, at least to a degree, with their regional rivals ever since the Iranian Revolution. But I would imagine, once again, when it comes to the actual construction of missiles, it is sourcing material that has been the difficult part. And as these sanctions do expire and are, of course, not set to be renewed, that is going to become far less difficult for the Iranians to build up a more robust missile program. And you have several presences of American troops across the region. There's still a vestigial amount in Iraq. There, of course, are the American troops in Syria with the so-called SDF. You have the Fifth Fleet in the Persian Gulf, which is infamously the subject of the, what is it, the Millennium 2002 challenge, where they had the war games against the Iranians. Now, I know war games can be very deceptive. They are meant in order to gin up funding and support for whatever branch of the military it is at that time that's being tested. But the Millennium Challenge 2002 did have some interesting points if you were to take it at face value, which I wouldn't take it at face value. But if you read into it, there are still plenty of interesting points to be taken away from the Millennium Challenge. But not to dwell on that too much. That's regarding the Fifth Fleet. And that's also on top of American forces in Kuwait and Qatar as well. And there were reports of strikes on American forces within Syria. So I believe that they've reported 7 attacks on them since the start of this conflict. In which case, if this does escalate, if we do see further American involvement, if this does become, I wouldn't say an outright regional war, but if this does have cascading effects across the region, even more so than it already is now, you have plenty of opportunities for the Iranians to strike back on the Americans, especially with the positioning of the Fifth Fleet, especially in the Persian Gulf. And they have the ability to cause a great deal of damage and wreak havoc if they are inclined to. And that would probably mean the case where they were pushed back into a corner where they could unleash, like I said, a significant amount of damage. Now, you also have the carrier groups that were sailed into the eastern Mediterranean, and speculation that Hezbollah, depending on what's in their stockpiles, might be able to also cause a great deal of chaos and destruction by hitting ships within the carrier groups. I mean, I do think it's worth noting that a fully staffed U.S. aircraft carrier, if one of those were to be sunk, the casualties would be equivalent to the entire Afghanistan war in
Oh my God.
in one attack. And that's if the carriers are fully staffed. And I might be getting into uh, mixed up, but I believe it's just the carrier and not the carrier strike group, but certainly the strike group as a whole. If they were to be sunk, it would be the equivalent of the entirety of the casualties of the Afghanistan war. In which case, if something like that were to happen, even if the U.S. were to do a queen sacrifice, so to speak, would that enrage the American public enough into a war, or would that give them such cold feet that the American empire would collapse it in even more accelerated rate? And I really think could go either way, depending on how good the media is at giving their spin and how much the public is willing to buy into something like that. Because I think that's been the problem with false flags in recent years and media narratives in recent years is that the uh, American Republic. It's not like that's been a thing in quite some time, but the American public, more appropriately, is once again, I would say post 9/11 at least, if not even before, is at such a crossroads where a calamity like that is something that, as I had just said, is going to push them completely over the edge where they are ready for another world war, or that is going to make isolationism a very appealing topic. Once again, that we've already lost however many thousands. Is it really worth any more? Should we just cut our losses and go home? In which case, while they would do everything they can to push against that, that would still be a significant undercurrent in American society. Where post 9/11, the majority of the population, you have Bush with a 90% approval rating, they're willing to sign on to anything. They're willing to agree to any program at that point, which is how you got Iraq and Afghanistan. But after at least 20 years of American foreign policy failure, not only in the Middle East but worldwide, Ukraine being one of the more recent examples, even people who were very ardently pro Ukraine at the beginning of the war, maybe aren't necessarily anti Ukraine now, but they've certainly soured on the prospect of supporting Ukraine from this point forward. It, it it's been foreign policy failure on top of foreign policy failure on top of foreign policy failure, including currently. So it becomes a very volatile situation if the American empire wants to get involved, because certainly I would say they would need a false flag to get involved or some sort of event in which they could justify
You do
intervention.
get the feeling that they want that.
Oh,
You do
absolutely.
get like this is what I was hinting at about like Iran getting hypersonic missile technology. That would be a red line. Um, and that this, everything from Hezbollah entering to the north to Iran getting, because why would Israel worry about that? Our Patriot missile systems all knock that all of Russia's jaws, right? Um, that you can see where this is going. I think America wants to go in there to some degree. Of course, the real game changer will be what if China goes for Taiwan when all of this happens, right? Would China go for it, or would China just wait for the spoils, as it were? Now, you know, um, Putin was in China recently for a One Belt One Road meeting. So that's that's a pretty big deal, but that doesn't necessarily mean I don't know that they will or won't go in. Again, like if America wants like a war, it would have to do it very quickly because it's just like Israel. They cannot do. They have to strike first because they don't have the depth, right? They lack the military depth for a sustained war. It's why when they went into Lebanon that they could not stay there, even though their losses compared to when they went into Lebanon in the 80s were hundreds of times less, right? They lost 10 Merkava tanks, at least that many armored personnel carriers, and I don't know, several hundred men. But like in the 80s, they lost over 1,000, right? So they don't have the depth to stay in the war for a long time. And in many cases, there are so many war fronts now that America is in a similar position, right? Like if it goes in, it has to strike first, and it has to strike really badly, and that means the casus belli, the false flag, would have to be very severe. It have to be very costly, and the retaliation would have to be worse. So
Now, on the bright side
yeah,
for our
just
American audience, what I can say is the kind of operation that America would need to conduct would be far too rapid for them to consider conscription again. So there's that at least. Um,
yeah.
Now, of course, if we're talking Ukraine or Taiwan, that's an entirely different set of circumstances. But if we're talking another Middle Eastern conflict, it is going to be something where they do want that coup de grace, so to speak, where they can very quickly end it because, as you said, they do not have neither America nor Israel has the depth to sustain a war like this. They do not have the they do not have it in them, particularly Americans, to wage another Iraq or Afghanistan style campaign in Iran, which is much more heavily armed and much more competent militarily. And
Mm-hmm.
with that, I think also the question of Taiwan, and this is something that a lot of people would probably disagree with me on, but I still somewhat maintain to, is that I believe at this point, right now, a diplomatic reconciliation between Taiwan and mainland China is still within the realm of possibility. And
Yeah.
I would actually say that if you did have a very drastic American action like another intervention in the Middle East, you may have people in Taiwan, the elite in Taiwan, look at this and look at how unhinged the American empire has become and might be more pro dialogue with Beijing. Now, I'm not saying that as a certainty, but of course, as America appears stronger as it projects itself more in East Asia, it's a pretty safe bet for Taiwan to try to align itself with America in the West. But if America becomes more unhinged, if it diverts more resources from East Asia to either the Middle East or Europe, at that point it might look more appealing to start up, maybe not even negotiations, but at least have some degree of some diplomatic line to Beijing when in terms of reunification talks. And I think that if we're going to see a war in Taiwan, I know I've talked about this before, but it does bear repeating. If we're going to see a war in Taiwan, it's going to come after either diplomatic options have been exhausted or outright sabotaged, much like in Ukraine for that matter. Because looking at Beijing's approach and even Taipei's approach, I do think that, especially from Beijing's perspective, they would prefer to solve this with a few treaties than a protracted war with an island fortress. Now, I'm not saying Taiwan's some sort of a invincible, unstoppable force. I'm not trying to create a mythology around it, but it is a very heavily armed, large island. In which case, I mean, China could win that war, even if Taiwan did have American support, but it would be a very
Taiwan would just be cut off.
yeah, yeah, it would be, but
It would be cut off. It
yeah,
would be cut off
absolutely,
financially. It would be cut off from any, like, China could cut it off and turn it into a Cuba until it folded,
yeah, and
right?
like I said, I that's why I think that I do believe China and Taiwan will undergo a reunification, and I think it will be relatively bloodless, much like Hong Kong. Now, I know Hong Kong did have some dissent, and they did have to use some force, but it wasn't a full scale war. And I still do maintain that that is well within the realm of possibility for mainland and Taiwan.
Yeah, and that was interesting, because the thing about Hong Kong was uh, it was the protesters who killed people. The army didn't kill anybody. And the protesters even killed an old man. They set him aflame. which reminded me of, Tiananmen Square, which was one of the first really great lies and propaganda jobs by the West. The numbers are not only highly exaggerated, but what they ignore is that the Chinese army stood down. And there's lots of other papers from around the world that covered this, right? Where you can see their Soviet era BMPs and BTRs that the Russians supplied them and then they copied them. They're completely burnt out. Dozens of Chinese soldiers were killed. That's what started that off, by the way, right? Um, but it was a a big success from a Western propaganda point of view, right? And I mean, I think that both Putin and Xi Jinping, I think they know where their countries are weak and where they're strong, and I mean, they both make mistakes, but generally speaking, they know the right strategy. However, like America basically has a choice, right? Like, in order for America to maintain its empire, it will have to do something very violent and very drastic. It will just have to do it. I mean, Biden said that, that the funding for Ukraine and Israel to win their respective wars will secure the future for Americans. He said something like for the next 50 or 60 years, right? I think they're very serious about this. And I've been saying it ever since the war in Ukraine started. But essentially, if they go slow, if they have no military in depth, then basically what they're going to do, like suppose they go all out for, I mean, I can't imagine the war in Gaza is going to last as long as Ukraine. That's not going to happen.
Oh,
But
absolutely not.
it will slow things down significantly, right?
And especially if it does, I'm not even talking full scale war with the entire Shia Crescent, but if it does fester, maybe we have increased tensions between Israel and Hezbollah. If there is perhaps more skirmishes in Syria that I mean, we even saw Israel strike the Damascus and Aleppo airports last week. If there is issues with the Gulf states, not even militarily, but point being is there are a lot of things that even if the Gaza war in and of itself is a short affair, the ramifications and the impacts in the region are going to be long lasting. It's going to put Israel's security at risk. And it's going to be something that they're going to be much more mindful of, something that's going to necessitate more aid to Israel as a result of it. And I think, especially with the vectors with Hezbollah, as well as other Iranian backed groups in Lebanon and Syria, is going to be something that Israel suddenly becomes very concerned about. Or I shouldn't say suddenly, but becomes much more concerned about than they even were before then.
Hmm. So like if they decide, like I guess what I'm basically saying is like America cannot fight all these theaters at once. If China goes in, right, it has to forfeit Israel and Ukraine. It is what it is, right? Even if Japan and Australia join in, it won't be enough, right? And the only thing that China would have to do to draw in um, the Americans is to begin a blockade, like a real blockade of Taiwan, to put a deadline. Uh, That will draw the Americans in, right? That will be a major staring match, right? If that goes hot, right? They don't have like I said, how like Russia is outproducing them by 7 times just for artillery munitions, right? And then Ukraine Pravda published a story today saying that they examined the remains of a Kinjal and realized that the chip inside the Kinjal is a Russian chip. It's not foreign. So they're not going to run out of Kinjal missiles, right? And when Russia slows down the amount of Kinjal missiles, it's because they're saving them for another day. And they will begin that barrage, I believe, as winter sets in. They will apply the pressure.
Now,
So
that leaves me with one last, I suppose, question you could say regarding this one that I want your take on, that frankly I want the audience to take on. Now, I want to preface this with saying I do not believe that this will happen, but I do believe that there's a possibility that this might be attempted. And even then, I'm a bit on the edge about. But if there is a blockade of Taiwan, if the Middle East is still in a very volatile, if not outright violent state, and if the war in Ukraine is still on, will we see some sort of attempts to make concessions to Russia in order to court them against China, as they've tried to do for years, or vice? I mean, not vice versa in this case, but we even saw at the beginning of the Ukraine war where they tried to get China to go along with the sanctions package. They tried to talk China into denouncing the Russian military campaign.
they couldn't even convince India.
Oh no, they that's the level it's at. But at that point, what other choice do they have but try to drive a wedge between the bloc? And like I said, I don't think it will work. I think it's probably going to be laughed off by the Russians at that point. But uh, even when it comes to full American war machine, when it comes to them saying that, oh yeah, we're dedicated to another full scale war, I don't even think that's going to be enough. In which case, they're going to try to crack
There
through.
is one way out. There
Yeah,
is one way out for
yes.
the Americans.
Go on.
Okay. The one way out for the Americans is to get Israel in a war with Syria and to increase America's participation in that war, and basically to just call out the Russians in Syria. Just call them out. Force them to send even more men there. That's it. If they do that, right, China will be tested. They will have to prove something, right? Now, it's possible that this can happen if escalation with Hezbollah increases, and that Israel will spend, like, America will have to up its efforts, because remember, two of their bases were attacked just today and yesterday, and also their base right near Baghdad Central, their Air Force base was also attacked. They're attacking them with drones, right? In I believe in the attack in Iraq, there was an American contractor who died of a heart attack, and there have been some injuries to the soldiers at one of the two air bases, or I don't know, they're not necessarily air bases, but bases in Syria. Now, also one of their pipelines or oil refinery was damaged today. But the Turks 2 weeks ago attacked one of their pipelines, right? So the Turks are beginning to lash out against them, right? Remember, they need the Kurds to fight the Turks, the Americans do, right? And the Turks are killing the Kurds. So, but I would say that the least risk for the Americans is to get get them to resolve the war in Gaza as quickly as possible and continue onwards. If they have bigger ambitions, that is, they want to more quickly change the scenario in Ukraine, then you attack you increase the pressure on the Russians in Syria. That would be a big move. That would be a very, very big move with the Americans if the Americans did that. Um, so I said that would be the easiest way, but let's just say the Russians stand down. I mean, would they? Like, their bases in Syria are very important to them. Um, but the theory goes, if they don't, China will get intimidated and everything will go back to normal. Like, it would be like I say, it's a big risk, but it's a smaller risk than going after China over Taiwan. And the safest way to go about it is, let's say it's a false flag. All it would have to be would be like a small missile that kind of damages one of the carrier group vessels, right? It's not going to sink, right? But it damages it. If that happens, then Israel has the green light to completely ethnically cleanse these people right away. America will help. They'll bomb them too. The greatest allies together. You know,
It really is. I don't even want to call it a winning move, but it really is the only reasonable out they have, short of completely firing up the war machine. In which case, even that is not a.
like for the Biden team, he needs to make this last till his election.
Oh,
He,
absolutely.
he, he like even if it's not Biden, the Democrats desperately want to win, right? We're just a little over a year away. We're a year and just a few weeks away from election night, right? He needs to give the money to the Ukrainians for them just to last out, right? Right. The scary part is what Tusk does with military aid. That's the scary part. That's the gap filler in Ukraine. That's what will force Russia to like either step up more because they said in 2024 they're going to go from 3.5 or 3.9 of their GDP to 6% of their GDP to fight this war. So they're going to invest more into it, right? Question is, um, how is the Russian public going to react? Like, can they last out? What about Ukraine? Ukraine also has an issue with conscription. Like, they have a very big problem, right? Now, even young men who go to university will no longer be allowed to go to university. So it's a very desperate situation. And in many ways, this ties back to what I said at the beginning. And if Avdiivka can bring to light all these issues even more as that battlefield begins to intensify. So easiest way is false flag, bomb Gaza, bomb Lebanon, keep Syria out of it. Except Israel is going to continue to bomb Syria anyhow, but and then get Poland to transfer the weapons into Ukraine, give Ukraine the 60 billion, and Bob's your uncle. That will last till November 2024. That's the safest bet.
It does make me wonder, with the mention of the election, I think we can agree that Trump is, in many ways, controlled op, and that if he is allowed back in, it is going to be for a specific purpose. And that is probably going to be ginning up support for another intervention. Now, where that intervention might be is the real question. I would imagine with somebody like Trump, probably either East Asia or the Middle East. I'm not saying that Europe or Ukraine is out of the question, but I think we're much more likely to get the other two. And if he's allowed back in, not that I think that Biden or whatever Democratic show that they put up would be much better, but I think it's almost a certain sign that the U.S. is going to get involved in something far deeper if they're willing to give Trump his second go around. But that also runs the risk of Donald Trump just by his own existence is very poor optics, and just the way he talks is also very poor optics, and that he is in many ways a liability for the American empire. They have found ways to make him into, I wouldn't even say an asset, but somebody who doesn't outright sabotage their plans either inadvertently or inadvertently. But I could, we've talked about this since he's left office. I could see them rehabilitating Trump to a degree in order to put him back in order for him to take the more drastic actions. And I do think that is the path we're heading down if we do see a Trump victory. And I do think that is something that is somewhat likely that he does manage to come back in power. I mean, and of course, if he is allowed back in power, we all know why, and we know that with the completely legitimate American election system, that yeah, he was somebody greenlit that, somebody greenlit that, and we can look forward to him carrying out a much more drastic action that they couldn't put in the hands of the Democrats. They need somebody who's willing to get their hands dirty, even if it is for the sake of his own quote unquote legacy.
I mean, okay, so Trump had a speech recently where he was basically saying something like, I would bomb them into smithereens and so on and so on. You know how he is about Israel now. He did criticize Netanyahu, right? He's not on good terms with him anymore. Of course, Netanyahu abandoned him right away. Wow, what a surprise! After he lost the election, or the election was stolen, however you want to look at it. Um, the problem is Biden only had, from one report I saw, like how many people watched this speech? It was quite small. So a lot of people, a lot of Americans aren't watching Biden. It doesn't mean the money isn't going to go through just because they're not watching him, but they're disengaged, right? And you could argue that what America has in plan for the next 2, 3 years is going to need a lot of engagement. And Biden is not the guy that's getting people engaged, right? So they need, the drastic step would be get Trump in office, tell the liberals to shut up, throw some red meat for the nationalists and the conservatives in America, right? But on the condition that he goes to war, right? Because non-whites, mixed race, blacks, they're not going to fight that hard for the American empire, right? To be totally honest, I'm not even sure how many white guys still want to die for the gay, you know. Um, but it's their best bet. I mean, if that doesn't work, then America has to do something very drastic. I mean, psychologically, it's not just America, but psychologically, there are a lot of countries that cannot deal with America not being in charge of the planet, right? It's a very, very big deal for
Not
them.
even psychologically, but in terms of their own existence, they are completely reliant
Yeah,
on the umbrella of the American empire. And
yeah,
the most recent addition to that club is Armenia. And now that they've
yeah,
cast their lots in with the West, it's going to become something that's drastic. But not only Armenia, but uh, several nations. And
yeah, yeah.
the very loose piece that does exist in Europe is liable to fracture. Now, I will attribute much of Europe's long lasting peace to the result of the population transfers, either bloody or bloodless, of the first half of the 20th century. Now, I'm once again not either justifying or wagging my finger if those is far too complex to have just that one take on it, but the fact that up until the migrant crisis, most European countries were ethno states from 1945 onward, just to say for the sake of simplicity. But you could get the few outstanding conflicts left in Europe flare up. The Middle East would certainly all hell break loose there with how intricately the American Empire has the security system there. And even the situation in East Asia, where all these countries that are united under an American security umbrella might realize that beyond that, their interests really are not that much aligned, and especially as China is able to exert more influence in its own region, and even as countries that have been traditionally hostile to China, think Vietnam, are even more willing to cooperate with the Chinese now than they are the Americans, with the way recent events have been. It is not just, I mean, I agree psychologically that, yes, a lot of nations aren't prepared to handle that, but in terms of their actual existence and their position in the world, there are a myriad of nations that are reliant on the American empire staying in its
Hmm.
unipolar position. And I think we all know which nations those are.
Right. And the biggest one, or the one that sucks up the most amount of money and resources, is Israel. And what did Biden say? He reiterated what he said many, many years ago. Even if there were no Israel, we would have to invent an Israel.
Yes, right after he claimed he was born in Israel. But yes.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
also,
the Professor Biden.
Professor Biden. I suppose the only way to really end the program is to forgive me for this, quote Nancy Pelosi, that even if Capitol Hill were in
Yes,
shambles, the United States would still stand with Israel.
of course.
And
Oh, did you see that clip with Vaush where he's
yeah,
saying,
he sent that to me.
yeah, I know it looks right now like Israel, and this is going to be like he doesn't say the term red meat, but it's going to be like red meat for the fascists, for the American Nazis. But it does look like Israel runs America, and that's not good for our recruitment. For our recruitment, he's I forget exactly how he worded it, but he implied he must have been talking because it's a clip. He did mention recruitment or something to deal with the American military, right? Because there was some kind of report that um, American men in the military don't want to die for Israel, right? This was apparently an email that was leaked. So he brought this up. I just thought that was very interesting that he said that. You can tell what an absolute like neolib NAFO guy he is. He was that even before the SMO started. But yeah.
Well, I mean, all these
So
types of people, they all fall in line when it's time to fall in line. The ones that don't, there's a reason they aren't associated with those types anymore. But yeah, that was very interesting to mention. Not to mention also the pro-Palestinian demonstrators who had their own January 6th today, and that
yeah,
was
yeah.
that was kind of
Oh
funny.
man, I'm in a chat with some very Israeli sympathetic people, and um, I mean they're not fanatical about it, but let's say they're like for the genocide based on what they post. Um, and one of them was complaining about these guys, and they had rebel news like trying to do some gotcha moment. I don't even bother watching the videos, but that's what I presume the video was about. And I said, the important thing about these groups, there's several important things about these groups. Okay, so one is that they're funded, right? They're not accidental. They're not really grassroots. And this describes the group that you're talking about in the Capitol building even more so, right? I said the thing you have to understand is the role of these groups is to get the refugees inside the West, right? They denounce the war, so they're spotless for doing so, right? But their function is to get them out of Israel or some other place in the Middle East and bring them into the West. As it's been going on for almost a decade, that means Europe. Because it would have too much of a destabilizing effect if it happened in America, obviously, right? But,
Yeah,
you
it's
know,
also a waste of resources when you can just dump them right off in Europe. It's
right.
and look, we've gone into the reason behind the migrant crisis and how having that wedge of anywhere from 10 to 30% of the population being not part of the ethnic stock is very convenient when you're under the thumb of a foreign empire. It very much leaves the way for some leverage. And I, I hate to keep dragging this out because I know we're almost at the 3 hour mark, but I do think it's worth mentioning in that regard is that France and I believe a few other countries have said that they're going to deport migrants who are expressing "quote unquote" anti-Semitic opinions. Now,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
what
yeah.
I like to imagine
What
is
happened to Don't Look Back in Anger?
what I like to imagine is that yeah, you have all these usual suspects continuing to do all the regular things that they do, but then they deport these Eastern European migrant construction workers for I don't know, like posting they cry out as they strike you, like like sending them back to
Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah,
That's how I imagine that policy being executed, but some people were saying like, "Oh, hey, cool, this is finally a resume-proof excuse to solve the migrant crisis." It's like, no, no, it's not going to be that way. and it's never going to be that way. But what I will
People really
say,
don't accept how bad it
no,
is.
no
It's amazing. The amazing of delusional optimism is just, I
I was
cannot
about to
believe it.
say a wise man once said, "Your optimism disgusts me." But
Yeah.
the most favorable interpretation I can give to that is that if they do want to maintain a wedge population around that 15 to 30%, they could use that as a weeding out mechanism where, they get rid of some of them but still keep enough to have the demographic destabilization. In which case, I think that probably is, regardless of this, I think that probably is the future of migration in Europe. They don't want a complete overhaul because they realize that that would just be going too far uh, in terms of a docile population and in terms of a productive population. They still do need that base stock of people, but they don't want to go overboard with it, and they still need to keep the wedge. So they're trying to strike this balance. No, like I said, I'm not fully sold on the idea, but I could see them using that as just a temporary weeding out mechanism before turning it on the European right wing that isn't fanatically dedicated to Israel. But uh, you should know any crackdowns on quote unquote anti-Semitism in Europe is not going to be targeted at the new arrivals, I suppose we'll call them.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess now that we've crossed the 3 hour mark and we've met our
Yeah.
obligation, that's all I had for this very in depth episode.
Surprisingly, I have two very small stories to announce.
Oh, wonderful.
One of them is European, the other one is Ukrainian. The Ukrainian story is so Ukraine has now outlawed the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and it comes one day after uh, the support for the law on the legalization of gay marriage
Surely
has
just a
been brought to the
coincidence.
rada. Yeah, it's like you want that 60 billion? This is what you're gonna have to do. You can't be America's friend unless you're gay. So the other
Or
story,
Albanian, but what's the difference?
the other story is Kaya Callas. So about 2 months ago, Kaya Callas's husband was found to have like business that did well like 30 million euros with supplying a Russian plant, some kind of industry in Russia. Anyways, there were some people who called for her resignation. She refused to resign, right? So, like, she's well off. Her husband is very wealthy, and he has this business going on with Russia, right? Like, literally helping them. But they still won't fire her. Like, they still won't get rid of her. Anyhow, all this came to a head because the Hungarian foreign minister, Peter Sciarto called the words of the Estonian Prime Minister Kaja Kallas, who criticized Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban for meeting with President Putin. That's right, Putin and Orban met in these last couple of days. Hypocrisy in a cube is what she called it. But then he said, this is the same Kaja Kallas whose husband even after the start of the special military operation, owned a stake in a company that supplied raw materials worth 30 million euros to a Russian plant. So I'm assuming this plant, I don't know what they make, but anyways, those are the two stories that I had.
Yeah, it is amazing. No matter how hard they try the sanctions, either they completely crush their own business interest or violate the sanctions in order to maintain their business interest. In fact, I actually
Yeah,
saw, I think it was out of Finland. I just saw a story on Telegram that I think some of their residential construction is going to be affected by the sanctions, in which case it's going to stop the building of course, new houses, apartment blocks, very necessary and vital things to any society. But in a way, that was the point of the sanctions. Just as much they were meant to harm Russia, they were meant to kneecap Europe, and they've accomplished one of their goals at least. So
hmm
I guess Washington can rest easy knowing that. But now finally, that is all I had. So thank you everyone for tuning into this episode of the War Report, and we'll see you guys next time. And goodbye.
take care.